maybe Mikey, you want to start by talking about why you wanted to do this in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. So this is all my best friend Shannon Jackson's fault. She's one of my friends that's actually always been interested in what I'm doing. Well, psychoanalysis. She's not so much philosophy, a little bit, but she's always been interested in the psychoanalytic stuff. And she watched the movie. I don't know who told her about it, but she watched it and she was like, "You got to watch this and tell me what you think." And I was like, "Okay, fair enough." And as I started watching it, I'm like, this is just a great opportunity for us to come together and talk about the differences between Lacanian psychoanalysis and doing therapism or therapy culture, or maybe even more broadly speaking, ego psychology. It's an opportunity for us to explain where we're coming from theoretically and how it differs from what most people think of as therapy,
right?
Or even psychiatry by extension. It's psychology. And so yeah, it's Shannon's fault, and shout out to her son Ryder. Hi Ryder. So
yeah, shout out to Shannon.
Yeah. So yeah, I primarily am just like, this is a good opportunity for us to talk about Lacan, and I feel like it's a learning opportunity. It's like, of course, I know that when the three of you watched it, you're sitting there and you're having problems with some of the shit you're hearing and seeing, but again, we forget sometimes what a niche theoretical area we're all interested in, and it's things like these when they pop up in pop culture that give us an opportunity to get people's ears. Like they'll be interested. Like, I know you're interested in psychoanalysis or psychotherapy or whatever it is, and then we can come in and go, all right, well, there's some stuff in there that I understand why it resonates with people. There's some other stuff I have issues with. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I just think it's a cool opportunity to talk about Lacan.
Yeah, most definitely. I agree. Because like they're not going to be obsessed with like, you know, Lacanian theory or psychoanalysis in the way that we are and fixated on, and we're constantly grappling with concepts in discussions or in our blogs or channel, whatever. You know, they're seeing this from like a distance, like, oh yeah, this is something that, you know, Mikey would like, or Nick would like, you know, etc. Like, I know you guys are always reading philosophy. It's like when somebody is like, oh, you know, I see you're always reading a lot. You know, I just picked up this book and like it's 48 Laws of Power. It's like Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck.
Yep.
Like they don't know any better. Like, and so when they see this and they like see like a few names that are kind of profound, like, you know, Marcus Aurelius or like Nietzsche, then just like, oh, you know, I think I've seen, you know, Dave or like, you know, whatever, read this, so I think they might like this. So it's in the same context. It's like the same form of like, they see, you know, a really, you know, niche documentary on like therapy. So it's like something that would resonate, and it does create a good opportunity, you know, to kind of bring a little Lacanian interpretation and immanent critique in it, or just overall psychoanalysis, Lacanian, Freudian to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's something that's going to be more appealing to the broader mainstream, because something like a DuLacahn, while it is pretty good, doesn't really capture a general audience. Like, you already have to know who Lacan is. Yeah. And it's for a specific, and I do think it's a little better, like, but again, you have to be in that framework because it's going over like a sort of obsessional, right? With Jonah Hill, it's more appealing because everybody can relate to the term depression, all right, or struggling, trying to fulfill their life purpose. Now, we know, like, from our framework, this is sort of like ideological therapism with these terms, but this is the whole point of this like discussion, to kind of flush it out. And
yeah,
I kind of, that's my mindset on this.
That's a perfect opportunity to explore what psychoanalysis is by showing what it's not, you know, via negativa, basically.
Right.
Totally. I'm glad you brought up a DuLacahn, because I think it does make a good double feature. It might not be the most fun double feature I can think of, but no, it's interesting for somebody to watch them and they'll see this contrast. Like, Dave, I love how when we were watching the DuLacahn, one of the things that really stood out to you is that scene where he's insisting on her pain. And I loved how explain it. Like, I love the way that you talked about that scene, because I think it serves as a great contrast to what we're seeing in Stutz.
Yeah, it's very like he makes it, the director, but also Lacanian in the actual film, makes it painfully obvious that this is a moneyed transaction. Like she's getting up and she's walking out and he's all he's got his hand out, and she's all like, why do we have to do it like this? Why can't I just like pay them later, or like you send me the tab or whatever? He's just like and I think he says something along the lines of, what, and have you forget what this is?
Yeah.
Right.
And
he's not gonna lie to you.
Kind of gets at the heart of this, right? The heart of the difference.
Right. There was
yeah
change.
Let's, at what point did Stutz or Jonah ever discuss the fact that underlying all of their I love yous that they share,
right,
is probably thousands of dollars a year, like
one thing Stutz did not mention, nor did Jonah Hill. How much does he charge a session?
Exactly.
I get it. His technique is revolutionary. It's going to change everyone's lives. How much does it cost?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially for someone like Jonah Hill to be like under his wing for so long, right? Not everybody has that money or baller money, or even like maybe an insurance agency that could cover that amount of sessions like consistently with a psychiatrist like that, right?
I will say this. Well, I mean, because the money thing, like, I definitely want to talk about that. I'll just to say, I would rather have Stutz as a therapist than Peterson.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. I would
I mean,
Gabor Mate than Peterson.
Okay, I'd say the main difference though is personality, not technique.
Right. Yeah. And see,
I would say that
you make a good point, right? Because even in me making that comparison, I'm operating at the level of the ego to ego. Do I like this person? Do I not like this person? Right.
Right.
But they are both a mashup of Jungian psychoanalysis and CBT.
Mm-hmm.
And they both act like they invented it.
Right.
So here's one thing. And I want you guys to help remind me, because I'll forget this. Like, I want us to be able to share this with people who are not just into Lacanian psychoanalysis or this bigger discourse of therapists. Like, I want to try to define some of these terms for people who are hearing them for the first time. And, that can be a tall task.
Yeah.
But I think as we move along in the discussion, it's helpful. Like, what do we mean by ego psychology? What do we mean by therapism? I mean, they'll get a gist of, obviously, because we're going to talk about Lacanian psychoanalysis, and that's what we all do. But the other ones, we need to not presuppose that they're all tapped into what we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from the book One Nation Under Therapy, Christina Hoff Sommers says therapism valorizes openness, emotional self-absorption, and the sharing of feelings. It encompasses several additional assumptions that vulnerability rather than strength characterizes the American psyche, and that a diffident, anguished, and emotionally apprehensive public requires a vast array of therapists, self-esteem educators, grief counselors, workshoppers, healers, and traumatologists to lead it through the trials of everyday life. Children, more than any other group, are targeted for therapeutic improvement. We roundly reject these assumptions. Now, she's a conservative, but she's building off of the shoulders of a former communist who wrote a book called Therapy Culture. Frank Ferretti had written a book 2 years prior to One Nation Under Therapy. They're both saying the same thing. He calls it therapy culture. She calls it therapism, because she's talking about the ideology of this stuff. Right. So the thing I think we should do really quick though is just okay, there are positives about this movie. Mm-hmm. and kind of really quick for someone who watched it but doesn't, and has a vague feeling of what they thought about it but doesn't really remember that much of it, or for a person who's never seen it before, let's just like touch off the major points. So, well, what happened here? what happens in Stutz? What makes this a perfect piece of therapy culture?
Well, I mean, basically what you have is Jonah Hill has been working with a therapist for many years. His name is Phil Stutz. And Jonah is a big fan of his and says that his life has improved drastically because of what he's learned from Stutz and the therapy they've gone through. And this is kind of a movie about their relationship, how both
Right.
of them have helped each other. And I mean, and what Jonah's essentially trying to do is introduce Stutz and his psychological theories to a broader audience. But you can tell Jonah really does love this guy and appreciate his views on the psyche and what a good life consists of. And he does think this is something that could help people. And so he's trying to introduce this form of therapy to a broad audience. And throughout the film, you learn stuff about both of them, and you get a sense of their friendship. That's part of the maybe the issue we'll have.
Alarm
there.
bells.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Alarm bells. But nonetheless, as a film, you can say it's heartwarming, and it's a cool portrait of two people who have had a positive impact on each other's lives, and I don't think any of us would deny that. And so yeah, there's something touching about it. It's just our issue is a methodological one or a practical one.
Right.
In even if they've helped each other, and I have no doubt about that, it doesn't mean that the actual work of let's put it like tearing with his unconscious, right?
Yeah.
It's not something that's actually tapping into the unconscious. Even if Stutz wants to make a reference to the unconscious here or there, it's not the Freudian unconscious, it's not the Lacanian unconscious. And it's a type of therapy that, despite paying certain lip service to the unconscious, really isn't about engaging the unconscious.
Right.
And that's going to be our issue with it.
And I think when you mentioned in our prior conversations about there's this sort of pseudo Jungianism to it, because he does mention a sort of shadow,
yeah,
and the way it projects out, and then like to kind of acknowledge it, and this whole thing about strengthening oneself in adversity is sort of this like watered down Jungianism, because like at the end of the day, it's not tackling even a Jungian unconscious. Like there is an aspect to the ego, which is of course a shadow, but that's like supposed to be something that kind of has to be recognized as sort of a projecting mechanism that acts like as a vehicle for the sort of unconscious that even Jung was talking about for a sort of transformation. But at the end of the day, I think there is a sort of ego psychology, not to digress, in Jung, because it wants to make the unconscious conscious and integrate. We could see this in sort of what's going on in Stutz, because he wants to make him more resilient and get through sort of the struggles of life, because he kind of breaks down this sort of thing about adversity, struggle, and pain, and then no matter what, you're going to have to deal with this, but with the right tools, because he always references this, always kind of seems to go back to like his technique is that he gives you tools. I know he repeats that a bunch of times, and with these tools, it'll give you the sort of weapons to handle life. And this is sort of the same form that ego psychology has, to strengthen your ego so that it could handle, the sort of, I guess, defense mechanisms or variables of the sort of external world that may cause a lot of affects that trouble you, which
like you feel,
which pretty much feel kind of Freud, right?
Right. And so it's like you feel insecure,
right,
because you've been traumatized. And so what you need is self-esteem. And the way you'll find self-esteem is by learning how to be vulnerable. And learning how to be vulnerable is practicing honesty with your therapist.
right.
And that's the basic American understanding of ego psychology.
Right.
And what Stutz does in his book, Tools, which is co-authored with, Barry Mitchell's. Okay, I was checking this out earlier in
Did
preparation.
You get to read some of it?
Oh yeah, and you're gonna
Okay.
love some of the stuff I see. You're gonna love some of the stuff I found.
All right.
But so I'll give you guys a quick little sort of. I mean, okay, this is important background, I think, for anybody who's interested in Stutz or the tools. But you know, if you have seen it, then this is a cool little bit of background information. So the book got published a bunch of years ago. I think it was like in 2012. And Barry Mitchells met Phil Stutz at a conference and was like, holy shit, this guy, or I don't know when he met him. It was probably like in the 90s, could have been back in the 80s, like who knows. But basically was very impressed by Stutz's seemingly maverick focus on providing people with tools. And so Mitchell's also, and everybody who's into psychology and therapy ultimately is looking to apply these things into their own lives as well. Like every therapist wants to live the examined life. And so Barry Mitchells is instantly exercising these tools, experimenting with them, and keeps coming back and interviewing Stutz. And so they get a good working relationship going. And he basically is like, you know, where are you getting this stuff from? And the long and short of it is that Stutz developed these tools out of frustration with the fact that he kept being put in situations with people who needed help. And his training told him to basically apply some kind of what we would call like an American ego psychology, Freudianism, an American version of Freud, where his job is to basically interpret them and tell them what the interpretation is. And then that's supposed to help them reach some kind of enlightenment. And so, you know, he's got patients coming in who've got these various, you know, red flags or clues that he interprets in the sort of textbook way. Oh, this is because of a repressed trauma from your mother or your father or whatever, you know. And then that doesn't seem to be helping anybody, and people want something that they can actually do. And so he resolved to start providing them tools, even if he doesn't know like the answer, he's going to at least give them something to try. And so I like the one thing I like about it though, is that it's not like this textbook CBT thing where it's already been figured out. And now he's just telling people, okay, now go do this thing. Instead, he is working with them, and what he does is reverse free association. So hearing what they're going through and what they're dealing with, after a certain point, he free associates on them ideas about things that they could try to do, and proposes an experiment. And he calls his, you know, he'll say, oh, here's a tool, I would like you to experiment with it. And so he's setting them up as a sort of scientific partner.
Right.
I think that that's admirable, because he's not just saying, oh, this is the solution, do this. Although in the documentary, you do get this idea that he's saying, fucking trust me, it'll work, you know. But in the actual book, he's talking about, no, it's an experiment. I'm giving you a tool, try it out, come back to me. Let's keep talking about how that's going. And it's going to be a work in progress, and we're going to refine it over time.
Right. I think that's also interesting too, because he never, as a psychiatrist, he never even mentions the DSM-5, not even once. And it's totally different from a CBT practitioner who already has work for you to fill, like do at home. You have to practice mindfulness. You have to practice like psychosomatic breathing or something like that. If you're feeling stressed or your automatic thoughts come up and you start like, was it predicting the future? Take a cold shower, or like, you know, go out for a run. Like all these things to do when you're not in therapy, and then when you're in therapy to talk about it. And then, oh, if it's getting worse, then call the crisis hotline or something like that. You know, I think he's definitely like more scientific, which it makes me think of something like very along the lines of a sort of like Rogerian type of humanist therapy, in which, like you said, not only does he listen to what the person is free associating, but he kind of free associates back and wants to get a correct interpretation. This is what like an interpersonal humanist psychology session would look like.
Right. And this is the lead off to the entire documentary, is Jonah Hill saying, friends give unsolicited advice when you want them just to listen. Therapists won't give advice, but just listen.
Right. I forgot.
And
yeah, you said, I like that. Yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Right. So
which is
he's sort of a
fine.
synthesis between a friend and a clinician
Right.
in that sense. And this might be where we get off board.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
and
yeah.
so you know, as I think about it, look, even as a Lacanian, there's part of me, I D&G or Deleuze and Guattari's concept of schizoanalysis, which obviously is complicated, but part of it is, and I feel like I do get at the heart of it here. Maybe Deleuze-Guattarian would disagree, but if Freudian psychoanalysis is about interpretation, D&G schizoanalysis is about experimentation. It's trying to get the patient to do new things with their bodies, with their minds, you know, connect to the world in different ways, experiment. And my God, of course, that very well could help somebody in certain situations. I don't know how I feel about this either or when it comes to this. I think some people can definitely benefit from being put, if somebody, who knows, they could start playing sports and that could change their life, or they could develop a love of music or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, Dave, he said Stutz is a delusion. I mean, and here's the thing, right? D&G they're more open to Jung than
Right. Oh yeah,
DuLacahn
definitely.
and Žižek, right? And so I can see, you know, something, maybe a connection there. But I guess the thing is, people can come into therapy having different problems, and this idea that every problem needs to undergo the type of interpretation or, you know, standard free association. The problem is, yes, sometimes I think that's exactly how you resolve the symptom.
Right.
And that it does, like, simply experimenting with new activities, that hard kernel of your unconscious is not going to be undone. That's not going to relieve the symptom. But what if part of the issue isn't actually symptomal in that strict Freudian Lacanian sense, and it's about depression with being worn out with your existing state of affairs, and you need to connect in the world in a new productive way? I don't feel like we have to rule that out as Lacanians, that there's something to that.
Definitely not. But here's the thing I kind of wanted to add, because there's one problem I did have with Stutz, as far as a documentary or movie, is that it kind of idealizes the therapy session, in which appeals to sort of the American, the sort of like American like consciousness of like, we go to therapy because we're unhappy or depressed. And I definitely do agree with you, Mikey, on the whole thing about experimentation and what Deleuze and Guattari are saying. But they're also going at it in the way that we're talking about a schizophrenic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Stutz, it's like somebody who's like, oh, I have no life purpose. I feel lost. I feel aimless. I feel depressed. You can't build that friendship in with your therapist like that when you're dealing with somebody who's, let's be object relational, who's borderline, right? Who's on the verge of psychosis. You can't be their best friend, and you can't tell them to experiment necessarily in that way. And there's going to be a lot of projective identification on the imaginary level. But since we're also attacking it from a Lacanian aspect, Lacanians don't believe in borderline. It's either you're neurotic or psychotic. And for a borderline, to them, it's like you're pretty much psychotic. So you're dealing with different things, where it's like you have to kind of build that transference relationship without it being counter-transferential. And I think that's the kind of sort of like what's the term, misleading notion that Stutz is getting. It's like, oh yeah, you could be a best friend with your patient, or like, you know, you could feel like, you know, your analyst or your therapist is a friend. But not everybody is purely this sort of like, yeah, I'm aimless and depressed. Of course we feel like that, you know, on our everyday sense, like when we don't have a job, that we feel, you know, that we are feeling fulfilled. But there are also people that are definitely obsessionally neurotic, who are definitely hysterics, who have borderline symptoms, who are definitely psychotic, perverse. And that same kind of framework that Stutz brings is what I think we should criticize in the sort of Freudian Lacanian framework.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point. Could he, I mean, obviously Joan is a good old obsessional neurotic. Okay, so would he, I don't know how he would even approach
right
a pervert or a psychotic in our Lacanian sense of the terms.
And so
you might just be like, all right, go to somewhere, go somewhere else.
And it's like, here's your, and then you go psychiatry mode and give them medication and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then see somebody else. But it's like, also like it, as Lacanian Freudians, like your analyst isn't your best friend. They're going to maintain silence, right?
Yeah.
So,
I wanted to ask about transference too.
Dave wanted to know about transference. So,
well, like, here's my question though, for everybody. How does this whole process of, I guess we're calling it like reverse free association, mess with the transference itself? Because couldn't you completely sabotage the like productivity of transference if you approach it that way?
Here's where we get into the whole critique of what Lacan has about ego psychology and relational psychology, the two body. And this is what, like, even
hold on. There's the old ears of this plebe are burning with rage. We've got to say what we mean by transference.
Yes, I'll get to that
before we move. Yeah.
So I want to get to this. So for Freud, transference is something that he observed in like his early scientific writings, that this sort of I would say projection onto your physician, or this sort of care in which you believe that they could cure you. And Lacan would orient this as, placing the analyst as a subject supposed to know. I want to touch more of the Freudian aspect, and maybe Mikey could kind of tie in more of the Lacanian. But that's what Freud essays on transference and the dynamics of it were about. It's the sort of being able to lay it out onto your analyst and free associate and feel comfortable and trusting. These are the affects of it. And of course, Lacan would say there's a sort of linguistic aspect to it, there's the three registers of it, not just the imaginary, right? But pretty much with Anna O, it's like, I feel like, you allow me to talk. Anna O was the first one to pretty much create the talk and cure, or be, noted as the one who kind of started the free associating thing. And it pretty much gives this sort of safe space, right? When you walk in, the first thing that analysis allows you to do is say whatever's on your mind. And you have to honestly have this sort of desire that your analyst has something to give you. So that is kind of the position in which transference.
What about this though? What are we transferring? Let's look at the word to transfer.
Right.
Is it that you assume your clinician has a certain special knowledge, a special ability, they can do something for you, and then with that comes a series of affects which are informed by past traumas,
right,
upbringing, other symbolic figures you've had in your life, and how you relate to them, essentially.
Right, especially when it comes to speech, definitely. And the main thing is not even for knowledge. If we get into transference love, there's a strong emotional erotic attraction in the way that, because your analyst is silent and listening to you free associate, you wonder what about their life. You begin to fantasize about them, like, well, what is it they like? Why are they so special?
Well, just to break in here, this is exactly why I think Jonah Hill wanted to turn the tables on his analyst, because of like that curiosity that is necessary to the transference as well. Because it's like in Lacanian and Freudian psychoanalysis, your analyst is can come off as almost inhuman in many ways, right? Especially if they are very secretive about their personal lives and like what they divulge. You're the one who's supposed to be divulging, but it's the asymmetry there that actually leads to transference and to make the tragement work,
and here's
so to speak.
The problem with relational and other forms of psychoanalysis that aren't Freudian, and why I think even non-transference based psychotherapy, even when they say they don't practice transference, there can be contingency for that, in the sense that, look at Jonah Hill and how he felt, and then putting his therapist, his psychiatrist on the spot and having him talk about their lives. This brings out what's called countertransference, which some schools of thought believe is helpful, but it strengthens the ego as much that it doesn't guide the treatment in a Freudian Lacanian sense, and sort of guides the patient and you're kind of fulfilling their own affects, wanting them to be like, oh, how do you feel about me? I could assure you that, I don't really think this way about you. This sort of bringing out one's own unconscious content onto the analyst and making them feel comfortable. You see this in a lot of object relations or two-body relational psychology, where counter transference is used.
So what about advice, though? Let's simplify things, like this idea of advice. You get advice from friends. This is the sort of dichotomy that Jonah Hill alludes to initially, right? It's like you have your friends who give you advice, but supposedly your clinician should give you something different than that. But he is giving advice, though, isn't he, at the same time?
And yet he's also, like, in a sense, I would imagine that it seems in my interpretation of this documentary, it seems like he's also counter transferring and making himself like, I'm just a normal person like you. I'm relatable.
I curse.
And they're not using transference as a tool, but it seems like because of the relationship of their treatment over time, this transference built up without them realizing it, without even Stutz realizing it, because he's not in the business of using transference as the only technique. Like, if we're Lacanian, it's like, what are the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis? Transference, repetition, the drive, and the unconscious. Because for the transference, it allows you to get to the unconscious and to see the compulsion to repeat. That's not happening.
So what's the unconscious for Stutz? What do we think? He mentions it twice, 2 or 3 times.
So, Dave, did you get a definition in the book?
So I think that we should bookmark transference, plan on coming back to it. And I want to propose that we run through, before we bring in some more Lacanian concepts, I want to just run through the main tools that Stutz got Jonah working with, or that Jonah wants Stutz to share with the world in this documentary. And it answers the question that you just asked, to start with the first one, because life force is the first one, which obviously from a Nietzschean standpoint, that's the will to power. Okay. Life force. It's basically just like, he says that we have like this unstoppable desire to do things, he says move forward. We always want to move forward. Okay, but people come into therapy because they're having trouble moving forward. And Stutz is talking about how people say, if I knew what I was doing, if I had a direction or a target, I'd be like out the barrel of a gun. But because I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just depressed. And so he always says, you got to bring it back to your life force. And so that he draws a pyramid. It's the body, it's people, and then it's self. And the body is going to be like your physical health. And when you don't know your direction, to work on these 3 levels is how you do it. And so with the body, it's obviously exercise and eating healthier and blah, blah, blah. With people, it's learning how to be more communicative, honest, vulnerable, whatever. And he talks about, like, you take someone out for coffee, even when you don't feel like it, even if you don't necessarily like love them, they are symbolic stand-in for all of humanity. You do it because you need to be building relationships with people, end of story. And then for self, to get to know yourself, you have to write. And writing is how you learn about your unconscious, because when you write, you learn things you didn't know you know. That's what he says is getting to know your unconscious, is writing. I want to say, I know that there's different definitions of the unconscious, but just giving him credit here, I love that.
Yeah,
I think that is,
you grow like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't think any of us would deny that, even a Lacanian wouldn't, or Freud, because Freud did even talk. He had an essay about creativity and the unconscious too. So, I definitely agree. I think it would be asinine not to agree with that. We're not just trying to what's the term with psychoanalysis, domesticate people, in the sense that D&G think there's a domestication of sort of neurotics. The whole becoming wolf instead of becoming dog. I think it was at 1,000 Plateaus.
Yeah. So for me, I'm a little bit as much, and you know how much I believe in writing, I think I'm a little more skeptical on that. And I'll tell you why, because do I think writing can help a person? Oh, hell yeah. Absolutely. I have no doubt that if people had the ability to write more often, it would increase the quality of their life. I go back to the hard kernel of the Lacanian unconscious. I don't think you write yourself out of a symptom is what like a strict Lacanian thing would be, where if there is a deadlock in your desire, if a symptom like a hysterical symptom has emerged, I don't think writing, and I don't think that's going to dissolve the symptom. I think it's going to take connecting these unconscious dots to do that. And so again, it's not that I'm for people writing. I just don't think it has an effect on a psychical conflict, the type that Freud and Lacan are talking about. I don't think it's enough to undo that. And so that's where I was going. Yeah, I mean, it's great for people to write, but that's not going to, if somebody has the compulsion to wash their hands 200 times a day to the point that their hands have been rubbed raw, I don't think sitting down and writing about their life is going to undo that symptom.
Yeah, and also, but and being depressed, writing could almost be something that could dig you in deeper in a sort of sense. But I mean, this is in conjunction with a bunch of other tools, right? And so, I mean, I'm pretty sure Stutz would say, well, yeah, but this writing in conjunction with part X and how you're going to deal with part. So part of it's like you're writing to figure out what part X is for you, and to work out your shadow and to figure out what your snapshot is, so you can get out of the maze through an act of love and radical acceptance and get down with that grateful flow. I just touched on most of the main concepts, I think. And so, but let's
I'll just say here. So hold on, because we all of us, we've been all over the place. I just want to say a couple things to clarify some thoughts I had on things that have been brought up.
Okay.
Just even the concept of giving the analyst tools is a little suspect to me, because you ask yourself, who are you giving the tools to? You're giving them to the ego. You're telling the conscious ego, hey, if you act in XYZ way, it will change your life for the better. But again, and maybe it does enhance the quality of your life. Maybe it this kind of experimentation, that's experimentation. There's a slip. Now there's a slip, right? Okay. I'm not denying that, but I just think that the unconscious, as understood by Freud and Lacan, we know that it's comprised of deadlocks and symptoms and traumas, and these things unconsciously impose themselves in ways on the conscious subject that the conscious subject is not aware of and does not have immediate access to. And so I don't think writing or applying tools, I don't like Freud and Lacan never go that route, precisely because it's like, oh, I'm the conscious ego and now I'm going to tools to the unconscious. That's what it can't do, right? That's part of the deadlock. And so I'm just skeptical when it comes to certain types of symptoms, the types of, and again, I keep saying symptoms, psychical problems, psychical conflicts that Freud and Lacan focused on, obsessional symptoms, hysterical symptoms. I don't think giving a patient tools or having them write are going to resolve those types of conflicts. And that's where someone like Stutz, I think, has limited himself. And oftentimes those are the things that people feel as though these types of symptoms or conflicts have entered their life as these radical external intruders. Like they've come into my life, they've destabilized it. I have no way, I can't control it. I can't stop washing my hands. I just have to do it. And it's like, I'm enslaved to that. Again, tools aren't going to get that type of person out of that conflict. And the psychoanalytic method, as discovered by Freud and refined by Lacan, I think is the way to deal with that type of symptom. And part of it is through the work of analysis and through the work of free association and interpretation, you come to realize this foreign thing, this symptom, this conflict actually is the core of me. Like it's coming from the inner, it's not like some demon, some external evil force that's taken me over. No, it's coming from the very core of my being. It is me. Like that's part of analysis for us is identification with the symptom. One, you go, this thing that feels like a foreign intruder that's just destabilized my life. It's me. It's the truth of my unconscious, the truth of my desire. And it's in a sense, my desire has been impacted, and it's taking on this manifestation. This is the way the desire through a kind of, it got short-circuited, so it can't immediately express itself. So it has to do it in a disguised, roundabout way, and that's the symptom. And when you realize your unconscious desire is the driving force of the symptom, you go, oh my God, like I am the symptom, right? And then just to close, and then the other part is, it's also an acceptance of I am a symptomal being. It's not that I have a symptom, it's that I'm symptomal. That my very being, the very type of creature or entity that I am, is one that is divided inside, and that I'm never going to attain some perfect sense of wholeness, that I'm always in this kind of conflict with myself. And instead of running from that conflict, it's an ability to embrace the fact that I am divided between conscious and unconscious, between ego and these obscene forms of enjoyment that I get, right? I'm divided. And the fantasy of wholeness is one of the things that's driving me neurotically crazy. And we see this in there, like they talk about wholeness a couple times and they go back. That's one of the huge things that you get from ego psychology and therapy. Like that's one of the key difference. And it's an ontological difference or a metaphysical difference. We think that we as human beings, as speaking subjects, are fundamentally split or divided within ourselves, and that we do all these different strategies to try to cover that over or to find a phantasmatic sense of wholeness. And that is precisely what drives us crazy, is we're chasing something we can't have. And if we identify not just with a particular symptom, but we identify ourselves as symptomal beings, then there's a sense of relief that comes in going, no, having a symptom is what I am. Like I'm divided. So that's a different way of.
I just want to say something briefly. It was interesting to me that Jonah Hill doesn't identify a symptom that he's dealing with. He says he's struggling with depression, anxiety, maybe.
Right.
But that's what everybody says. I don't think depression can be considered a symptom.
Right.
It's a state of an affect that is what someone can get mired in, of course, not to be dismissive of depression, but it's interesting because it's like there are so many people who could watch this documentary and easily slot themselves into where Jonah Hill is because it's quote unquote relatable what he's talking about. But again, it's like, here's someone who is, for all intents and purposes, healthy enough, healthy in quotes, like healthy enough to get by, but just isn't experiencing life with the amount of joy and exuberance that he would like, and just needs a boost, essentially. I know he had the tragedy with his brother dying and everything. I don't want to sound dismissive of it, but you could see where a major conflict would emerge if we're dealing with someone who is washing their hands 200 times a day. That's a different situation entirely. And if it's just a matter of, sit down, write, focus on yourself, go for a run, it's like, well, first of all, that's information I could get from Reddit. If I really wanted to, I could go and ask Reddit and, just say, hey, how can I improve my life? What is the solution to the symptom? Does the word symptom even really come up here in this documentary?
Well, two things, and then hold on, just two things, and then I'll let you guys have the floor. One, that's another difference. Psychoanalysis, as we know it, is not mood oriented. Moods do not, like, Freud and Lacan would sit there and go, fuck your moods. Like, this whole emphasis on your moods are bullshit. The only mood that isn't bullshit is anxiety. And there's a technical reason, we're not going to get into that. But the point for Freud and Lacan is that moods can become detached from the object or the state of affairs that cause them. And the mood kind of drifts around the psyche. It's not unconscious, it's not repressed. It just kind of drifts along. And so it can attach onto anything. And you think, we know that, like, why'd you take that out on me? Right? We know this happens. Whenever we say to somebody, hey, don't take that out on me, we have a gut level familiarity. Like, your mood is bullshit. You're taking out a mood on me. It has nothing to do with me. And how you feel about it's bullshit because it's not to do with me. Fuck your mood. And I mean, look, the right has taken, you know, the facts don't care about your feelings, Ben Shapiro shit. But Freud and Lacan would say there's a truth here that do not take your mood for the end-all be-all criterion of truth of your subjectivity. Your mood is not what anchors your subjectivity. And so for us Lacanians, we're not going to have a mood-oriented clinic. We're going to have a jouissance-oriented clinic or a signifier-oriented clinic, however we want to talk about it. But moods aren't it's like, yeah, bullshit. And that's part of the issue, is that if somebody's big conflict is that they have some bad moods, I don't know if that counts as a symptom or not. Like, I mean, look, Lacan defines a symptom as anything that is analyzable. So I guess if somebody comes in, hey, I'm always depressed, you could go to work free associating on it. But it's, I mean, I agree. I don't think it's a symptom in the hysterical sense of one that you're like, okay, this is making the person's life actually straight up unlivable. But again, severe depression can do that too. So, okay.
I want to add to what you're saying, to just so you can build off of it. This is not my own thing. But I just think if Jonah was tuning in, or anybody involved in the process, I'm curious. I think we should probably be fair and think it's likely that they left a bunch of shit out. I mean, they recorded this for over 2 years up to that point when they bring the green screen out. Yeah. It seems like it went on longer. So, and he'd already been in therapy up to that point before they started doing the movie. And so it's like, this could have been 4 years, 5 years. And by the time they're actually, simulating the therapy, and there's actual directing and acting involved. The part of the thing is like, Stutz is putting it back onto Jonah. Hey, talk about your brother, talk about this, talk about that. And Jonah's like, no, I won't do it. And then like later he's like, I need to. Okay. But they talk about his relationship with his mom, his relationship with his brother, and his relationship with his big fat teenage body. And more important than the big fat teenage body is the way everybody talked about his poor body. Like, the fact is he rocketed into fame at the most awkward phase a person can possibly become famous. And that was terrible because the coverage was very mean. So I think what's missing, and it's very likely, is just that he probably got involved with a lot of substance abuse and what we'd call repetition compulsion related to drug, sex, rock and roll as a coping mechanism for dealing with the fact that he couldn't live in his own skin, the fact that he felt like he couldn't approach a woman. And I just want to say that because I do think that repetition compulsion is, they talk about depression, but I think that he probably had a substance abuse issue that drove him in there. Just my guess.
Right. Well, I think that's a lot of good stuff. I think what Mikey pointed out about, like, the whole thing about wholeness, and then that the fact that there is this sort of fantasy of wanting to be whole because we realize that we're lacking something and we're split, but it's only through the being split that the fantasy brings up a sort of transcendental object, but it's only within the fantasy. I think Žižek says that in the 7 Veils of Fantasy, the transcendental object or the transcendental schema. But that's a part of the fantasy of being whole. And is on relation to this sort of imaginary function. And one thing that you pointed out, Dave, about repetition, compulsion, and addiction, right? You could get rid of addiction, you could still have the compulsion to repeat, right? I think this is something that Gabriel Mate gets close at, and he's like, not the substance, but why the pain? But then again, he's still on the level of moods, as what Mikey pointed out. Psychoanalysis, he falls short in this way because psychoanalysis, since our critique is mainly a psychoanalytic critique, is not in the business of moods, like Mikey said. And I want to tie this in with what Nick had to ask about advice. So advice still falls along the lines of a counter-transference. And you're not just going to give advice to an obsession neurotic, not just the hysteric, because the hysteric is always going to question, right? Like, you know, what power do you have? They're going to like try to question, like, you're the big other, or put you in the little other while trying to find the discourse of the big other, because that's who's speaking. Not the hysteric, but sort of the evocation of a sort of big other that usually gets displaced by a little other when they're in this imaginary dimension, right? If there's any questions on that, I'll get into that. But main thing I want to point out is that with an obsessional, they actually might follow your advice, and then it goes completely wrong because of the irony of an obsessional. It's sort of like a Seinfeld skit, like, yeah. So like obsessional, and they do things that end up ironically in the wrong thing at the wrong time, and it never works out, and then they always like wonder why. Like the whole thing with Lacan's joke about the boy who goes to the wedding and says, the funeral, and says, like, you know, many happy returns, and he gets beat up and yelled at. You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say, may God rest his soul. So then he goes into a funeral or a wedding, and it says, like, you know, may God rest his soul to the people that are getting married. But the thing is, there's this like obsession to do better or to follow the advice, but it's never at the right time. There's always ironic ending that causes more destruction. And to sort of, if somebody gives an obsessional neurotic a sort of like advice, like write more, do this, they may try to do that, and then they obsess, like, why did they have to say it like that? It reminds me of my mother or my father when they used to say this when I'm a little kid, and they start going on these weird spirals down and spiral down into this weird sort of fixation, fantasy, infantilism, the deeper that you get into the symptom. And that's why it's like, well, it's not about the moods that they're feeling, it's about what are the connections of these signifiers that create this sort of obsessional neurotic discourse that psychoanalysis is in the business of. So that's why it's always let the person free associate, and they just sit there like that listening, because this obsession can be like, I feel depressed, I've been sad forever, like the past 3 months I've never been like this, and they just sit there. What do you think the problem is? And they just sit there and they're obsessed, like, why are you silent? What do you imagine me to say? Which then hystericizes them and then puts them in this hysterics discourse to be able to free associate, which is something that you can't do if you're all constantly giving them tools, workbooks, giving them advice. Because then if you give them the advice,
they actually can function as forms of resistance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the fixation on part X, the shadow, the snapshot, and the maze as those basic sort of puzzle pieces of whatever the complex is that the person in their problem, in their journey, is usually stuck in, right? Would you say that it keeps a person stuck in the imaginary? And I just want to say, so part X, let's define our terms. Mikey, you took a lot of notes.
I wrote stuff on each of these just trying to be clear. So, all right, before we get to that, I just want to say, just to piggyback off of really what all three of you have said. So part of the issue, I think, though, Jonah wants advice. He has a problem with the distance, and maybe we could expand that to say the awkwardness of analysis. Also could say that analysis is boring, right? Dave, you talked about how repetition compulsion or jouissance could factor into the depression. What I think is at work here, and what I think Stutz, he doesn't have this concept. It's really just Lacan's. I mean, he gets it from Freud, but Lacan reworked it. Part of what Jonah, I think, is struggling with is the superego. And that, look,
yeah.
And let's make it clear, right? What is this? So when we talk about the superego, we're talking about essentially what he means by part X. Like part X is gesturing towards it. right?
Right.
But it doesn't understand the real libidinal aspect of it, which is to say it doesn't understand how enjoyment is related to this thing called part X. So here's what I have. Stutz's concept of part X is similar to the Lacanian superego. The superego commands us to enjoy, but then humiliates us whenever we fail to do so. This can take the form of us failing to be the best versions of ourselves, that is, the versions that are truly capable of enjoying themselves, that are happy, and that affirm their life wholeheartedly. The superego sadistically and viciously mocks us and bombards us with guilt for our inability to perfectly enjoy. If there is a bad guy in Lacanian psychoanalysis, then it is the superego. The superego is both the exploitation of the drive, which is to say the superego taps into this form of self-destructive enjoyment, but it does it for its own purposes, right? To make us not be satisfied with what enjoyment we do have. And it's also, the superego is also the underside of the big ego. And so that means the big ego, that's funny. The big other and the superego are the two sides of social authority. Now, we all know, I'm using a term by Heidegger here. Heidegger talks about das Man, which is the one or the they. So whenever we say something like, well, you know what they say, or whenever we say something like, just do what one does, right? Heidegger, with this term, is gesturing at this virtual authority that informs each and every one of us how to properly behave ourselves at a general level, right? Well, Lacan's name for this is the big other. And so the big other is this virtual structure. It tells us the proper norms, behaviors, etc., for us to engage in while out in society, right? But what Lacan and Žižek, what they see is that this symbolic authority, symbolic here, we could say social authority, has a dirty, obscene underside to it. And we call it the superego. And so this big authority, right, that operates in all of our lives, that is always, it's whispering in our ear, you know, don't do that. That's not what one does. What are you doing, right? On the one hand, part of it is there to guide us morally, ethically, traditionally. But the other part is there eating away at us, going, enjoy. Don't compromise your enjoyment. Go for it. Why are you such a failure? Why can't you just enjoy all the time? What's wrong with you, right? And that is the obscene dimension of it. But Stutz says that part X is also what makes life interesting and gives us something to struggle against. Now, this is a key thing, right? For me, as a Lacanian, I know that there's what we call death drive, which, simply put, is just this impulse we have that gets enjoyment from self-sabotaging, from undermining ourselves, etc. It gets enjoyment from us not getting what we want, what we think will make us happy. Because if we get everything we want, everything will be boring. The excitement, the struggle, the frustration that makes life interesting is actually in not getting it. And that's the source of our enjoyment for Lacan. So we call that death drive, but there's also superego, and they're closely related. Freud even says that superego siphons off a portion of death drive. And what he's getting at here is that death drive is this dimension of ourselves that simply enjoys repetitious forms of self-destruction. And it doesn't have to be these dramatic forms of self-destruction. It can just be the things we do that give us too much trouble. And so somebody could tell you, oh, I absolutely hate rush hour traffic. But when you see them banging on the steering wheel and cussing at everybody and flipping people off, you actually detected them like, no, there's an enjoyment they're actually getting out of this, right? And so that's the kind of thing we mean by death drive. What superego does is it takes that, it siphons off, it takes a portion of that enjoyment, and it makes it serve in the reproduction of society. So in a weird way, we're doing something that seems to be going against the rules. We're kind of doing something transgressive here, but in reality, it just keeps us locked into the reproduction of the system. And it does so by saying, see, you're kind of enjoying, but you're not enjoying enough. Enjoy more, enjoy more. This is a society of enjoyment. What's wrong with you, right? And so superego browbeats us for not enjoying perfectly.
Right.
But this is its power because it's tapped into this thing we call jouissance or enjoyment. We could even say death drive here. And Lacan said, it is jouissance whose absence would render the universe vain. Says that in Subversion of the Subject and the Dialectic of Desire. And so Lacan is saying our enjoyment is actually what gives our life meaning. Like if you take this excessive form of self-destruction, of self-sabotage, if you take that away from us, we're way off than with it.
Right.
But superego takes it and ends up turning it into a duty. It turns it into an obligation. So now it's not, okay, there's things I enjoy. I know that they problematize my life, but I need them to get by, right? That's not enough. If we want to talk like in like normie terms, okay, that would be a healthy relationship to your drive. There's things you're going to do that are excessive. You know what? Smoking isn't in your best interest. It's not what's going to, give you a good health, so to speak. But some people just need to smoke in order to get by. Some people need to drink. Some people need to overeat. Some people need to gamble. There's all these different forms of doing things that are self-destructive. And yet, if you deprive people of them, you can ruin their life. And that's one of these harsh realities of Lacanian psychoanalysis, but I also think it's true.
Right.
And
so that's a good point.
But superego, the problem with superego is it doesn't just allow us to enjoy as we go about things. Now we have to have a pressure to do it all the fucking time. And so this circles back around. So Jonah's having the therapy is boring. He doesn't feel like there's any immediate practical advice. I feel like that's the superego actually resisting the work of analysis by saying, why aren't you enjoying yourself? This is supposed to be fun. You're not having fun. What are you getting out of it? But I just feel like this is what Stutz doesn't see when he's talking about part X, that it's this demand to enjoy that's actually at work here.
Right. That was you covered a lot of key things, and just one thing I wanted to ask Mikey or clarify, because you mentioned the superego's imperative to enjoy and enjoy more, and then there's also the aspect of the compulsion to constantly repeat. This is what distinguishes drive from instinct, because with drive it seems like there's always this excess remainder, whereas instinct it's like the instant gratification of like hunger, shelter, right, reproduction. Yeah. But that's not the case with drive, and that's what makes us like fall into like the demise, I guess, of our own excess, because it's never enough. And totally. That's from the superego, correct?
Yeah. But, so I mean, okay, I didn't use the term in what I just said, but I'm gonna use it now. So for somebody listening who's not familiar with this stuff, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, we make this big important distinction between pleasure principle and death drive, or pleasure and jouissance, or pleasure and enjoyment, right? We talk about it in different ways. But pleasure principle is always seeking homeostasis. It's seeking stability. It's seeking power and control over our external state of affairs, right? It's seeking reliability, equilibrium, etc., right? So there is a sense we do pursue that. Like there's a part of us that wants that. And if we only operated according to that, you could say we are operating according to instinct, because what you see is animals typically, that's all they do is seek a state of pleasure, right? And they instinctively do it. Humans are bizarre. We got derailed from this. And so while we seek it in some ways, because of our cognitive ability. Now, Lacan's going to talk about it in terms of the signifier, which is not helpful at all here. This type of jargon. What we have here is that the reason we got derailed from just being able to operate according to instinct and constantly pursue a homeostatic relationship with our environment is because of language. And that sounds funny at first. Again, this is what he would call the signifier. But here's the way it works, is that language, once we're tapped into language, now we have this vast array of presence and absence. Now, what does that mean? Once language is involved, a word almost comes to have more significance than a thing itself. And we call this the word is the murder of the thing. But what's really going on here is actually kind of simple, right? Language makes it where something that isn't present can become present even though it remains absent, right? Yeah. So Jimi Hendrix, right? Okay, none of us were thinking about Jimi Hendrix. I say the name immediately. Jimmy's here with us, even though Jimmy's not here with us, right? Now, this ability that language has to make absent things present, and it can make present things absent. Now, how can it make present things absent? Okay, I'm looking at us. Now I say, okay, someday in the future, we are going to have another discussion. Now I've just put us in the future, right? And made us absent in this regard, right? Language does this crazy thing where you can compare and contrast the past, the present, the future. You can compare something actual to something phantasmatic, right? It's language that makes this ability to compare and contrast something against itself. So you think about, I mean, this is what fantasy is. I look like this right now. If I go to here and put in the work, I'll look like this, right? It's language that enables us to do this. And the same works for enjoyment, where I'm kind of enjoying myself, but if I was under this circumstances, I would enjoy myself way more, right? And so this is where we get derailed, because now we can think the more, the excessive, right? And we're also thinking, oh, I'm deprived of something, I'm lacking. Oh, but if I had XYZ, I would have a surplus, I would have extra, right? And it's through becoming what subjects of the signifier, which is to say language speaking beings, that this dimension of extreme lack and extreme excess becomes cognitively significant for us in a way that it just isn't for animals.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's kind of the way language derails us and gives us drives. And what we find is that the fact that there's always a greater enjoyment to be had, which again is made possible through language, what we find is like it derails us. Like it's not just the attainment of a spontaneous need. Now you start to enjoy the process of seeking enjoyment, right? And this is, I mean, the great example of this is that children enjoy sucking the breast, not just getting the milk for nourishment. And that's why they have a pacifier. Their mouth ends up doing these repetitious activities because the activity itself is the source of enjoyment and not the satisfaction of the need. And it's through this kind of, oh, if I just go, yeah, there's more to be had, right? Language makes all this possible.
Right. No, that's good, because that undermines, like, and last thing I was going to say, because I know Dave has something that he wants to say, but that undermines the whole thing of what therapy culture or therapyism has to say, because they want to always frame it in this sort of evo-devo evolutionary developmental psychology framework to some extent, and that it's your instinct or like to do this, and your instinct or your impulses to fulfill, you know, your self potentiality, and that's the only aim. But there's this, like, in doing so, even when you're mentally, you know, ill or you have depression, whatever your symptom is, even the process of like doing mindfulness, of having this sort of like asceticism of getting away from gambling or drinking, there's this sort of excess or demand in trying to always, oh, I need to meditate right now, you know, I need to follow my mindfulness app, or I need to go and do this thing because my therapist says so. and this excess enjoyment and sort of dictating and neuroticizing your own life or your symptom by regimens that you believe are going to help you get better. And so it kind of sort of is paradoxical to the sort of framework of evolutionary instincts of, oh, you're only frightened like this because like it's in your medulla oblongata, or like because
prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, it's a
backing up.
simulated picture of like when hunter gatherers they saw a lion, and you're kind of thinking the same way because of this automatic thought of fight or flight mode because your boss yelled at you. So this will help you.
Yeah.
But there's this excess, wouldn't you say? In the sort of asceticism of
no, totally. And that's part of what I think a lot of standard ethicists throughout history who, whether we're talking about Aristotle with the doctrine of the mean or Buddha with the middle path, like ethicists have always been big on, we need balance in our life, right? But what they don't understand, and this is the Lacanian twist, the very pursuit of balance or homeostasis itself can become an excessive compulsion.
Right.
And that's the death drive at work in aestheticism. Or it didn't even have to be aestheticism in the most strict ways or obsessive ways. It's just you can get this repetitious enjoyment. It can be that's I need to live a balanced life can become a source of excess in just that's what you fixate on. And if you're seeking balance in your life, that very pursuit is what makes it imbalanced.
Yeah.
Could we take the discussion in a more Žižekian direction at this point, given that we are the young Žižekians, and talk about maybe what is the latent ideology behind Stutz? I mean, we've already touched on it, but maybe more explicitly,
pick me.
ideological
So-
term. And what about adjustment? This idea of being adjusted. That's what Stutz is going to do for you. He's going to adjust you to what kind of side, what kind of framework. Dave, yeah.
Yeah. So there's this one thing we got to do before we do that.
Okay.
I really want to, because there's what you bring up, I feel like, is the grand finale.
Okay.
And the thing, I think what we could spend 10 to 20 minutes on, and this is limited, this conversation length time. So, but 10 to 20 minutes on this, and this is, I want you all to have your opportunity to talk about it. But I got to set it up because I did the book, and so buried in the book is something you're all just going to fucking love. But we'll start with the first quote. This builds up to where we're going. The first quote is something that will help, I think, clarify is it Shannon?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this might clarify for Shannon what you're saying about the whole thing about equilibrium and what we want is pleasure, but then what we really want is jouissance, which isn't pleasure, which is more limit, extreme kind of a thing. Okay. Because Stutz doesn't have this distinction in his toolkit, he says something like this quote. Here we go. He says, he's talking about the comfort zone, which is a specific section of the book. And now the comfort zone is not something he talks about in the actual movie, but it's a very important part of his worldview. And that is just that humans are prone to want to be in the comfort zone. That would be the equilibrium thing, right? And he says that, yeah. And so he's talking about pleasure. And so here's the quote. He says, we do this with an endless array of addictive activities: internet surfing, drugs and alcohol, pornography, the aptly named comfort food, even manic gambling and shopping are pleasures of a sort. All these behaviors are widespread. We're an entire culture looking for its comfort zone. You see the problem here, right, everybody?
Yeah.
That's not comfort.
It's not exactly.
Not, yeah.
I do not eat the whole pie for comfort.
No.
There's
You eat
initial
it because you
comfort.
enjoy giving yourself too much trouble.
Right. You want to destroy your
Yeah.
waistline. No, but yeah,
What you're rebelling against is the state of
Yeah.
comfort, in a sense.
exactly.
That's what you're trying to escape into the
Right.
excess of comfort.
Right. And so the other thing that's tied to this comfort zone for him is that on the other side of comfort is pain. When we avoid pain, pain becomes stronger. And so we've got to actually lean into pain and challenge ourselves. And this is basic. Everyone knows that you can't just hide from pain your whole life.
Right.
So there is something to that, but here's the next one. Here's the next quote. Because he doesn't have a concept of jouissance, and therefore doesn't have an understanding of the circuit of drive and how it works with jouissance and how all drives are death drive. And because he's not thinking about the distinction between the pursuit of pleasure and then these kinds of jouissance outlets that we develop, he says, well, I mean, this is the problem. So at the very beginning of the book, he's giving you the outline of what he's going to say. And the fact that this was up front, I was just tickled pink. He says, by the time you finish the next 4 chapters, you will have learned the 4 tools that will enable you to live a fulfilling life. You might think this is all you need. It's not. It may surprise you, but most people stop using the tools even though they work. This is one of the most maddening things about human nature. We quit doing the things that help us the most. It's almost like people already fucking know what they need to do. And so, I want you all to get your chance to kind of add to this. And so I'm not going to give my own analysis until later. I'm just going to read the part from chapter 6 that he was alluding to. So that he kicks off chapter 6 with this. He says, in all caps, this book puts a special power in your hands, the power to change your life. The self-help thing is so clear here. You know, it comes through very strongly. Anyway, he says, there's only one thing you need to do: use the tools. As a reward for doing this, you'll discover a better and newer version of yourself. Who doesn't want that? I certainly assumed my patients did. The tools I gave them worked as promised. They became more confident and creative, more expressive and courageous. The results were so good. I was completely shocked by what happened next. Almost every patient stopped using them. I was stupefied. I'd shown my patients the path to a new life for no good reason. They'd stepped off it. Even the most enthusiastic ones quit. Don't assume you'll do any better. My patients had a big advantage over you. They had me hounding them every week like a personal trainer. Without that, you're even more likely to stop using the tools. What is he describing?
And the death drive says, no shit, bud.
No shit.
So Freud's entire project reaches a breaking point called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he's basically, Freud commits hundreds of pages to basically working through this same realization. But but you don't want to know where he takes it. You want to know where Stutz takes it?
Human nature.
You know what the big
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but the big solution to it in chapter 6 is willpower.
Oh,
right.
God.
Willpower and responsibility. Right.
Personal responsibility.
So you're going to fall off of it, Jonah Hill.
Right.
Jonah, you're going to fall off of it. And don't worry, when you do, just remember you've got the spark inside of you, the spark of willpower.
Yeah. But even if like such a thing like willpower exists, like, you know, you always see in like these, you know, MMA or like Olympic events, like Olympic wrestling, where it's just like, you know, the dude is like, you know, down by so many points and then gets the knockout or gets the pin. It's like, well, what happened in you? It's like, oh, it's just this willpower, the spark in me, you know. But really, it's just like the sort of like the interjection of the superego, whatever that may be, that dictates someone like, no, you have to do this right then and there. So it's not necessarily even a personal willpower, but sort of like the voice of the superego that's like, no, you can't enjoy right here. You will do this, you know, and it could be strengthened through a sort of ego psychology. That's like, you know, my kind of nuanced opinion on that.
Dude, it's so funny that you used that example from wrestling because, or from MMA, because he uses this example of talking to this guy who is a really bad stand-up comedian who was constantly burning bridges, and you know, had this whole like self-fulfilling fantasy, blah 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 blah. Anyway, when this dude falls off, when he takes the tools for granted and then eventually falls off and comes back crying to, you know, Stutz for help. He gets him to sit down, and he gets him, he's like, okay, think of an example. He gets him to come up with this example of a boxing match. Vinny's like, he's like, think of a time where you saw this spark. And he's like, it was a boxing match. Does that count? And he's like, perfect. What happened? And he's all, this guy was fighting above his weight class, but he was holding his own. In the last round, he took a tremendous shot to the chin. He was lying on the canvas like he was dead. I know it sounds crazy, but after a 6 count, he suddenly came back to life. It was like he flipped a switch. The son of a bitch actually got up and finished the fight. He fought to draw. It was the greatest fight I'd ever seen. And then Stutz is like, okay, close your eyes and imagine the moment when he flipped the switch. What do you see happening inside him? Everything was dark. All of a sudden, there was this spark. You just saw what you just, and then he's all, you just saw what you're missing. And Vinny's all, that's it? That's what's going to save me? A fucking spark? And he's like, yeah, the fucking spark is the only thing that can save you. It brought that fighter back from the dead. You know what we call it? And he says, it's called willpower.
Okay, so this is where it helps to have a wide array of philosophers to pull from. Right. Because, okay, Dave, I haven't told you this yet, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and this will especially register. You, Andrew and Nick, you'll like it too, but Dave, okay, so I've done this experiment at work where me and the guys, part of our form of enjoyment or jouissance is breaking balls, giving each other, we say horrible shit to each other, and that's part of the enjoyment we get. And so I'll sit there in the morning, and I give myself this experiment. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go one whole day without engaging in this stuff. And I can't do it. And the interesting question to ask is, why can't I do it? I think I've figured it out. Okay. So when it comes to us as conscious beings, this is something Heidegger teaches us. Most of the time, we're not occupying this reflective first-person perspective of, I am consciously thinking about myself and what I'm doing. When you actually stop and think about it, that's a really, really rare thing throughout the day. Most of the time, now I know that sometimes we have an inner discourse going, but it's when you have an inner discourse, you're even, those of us who are into philosophy, you're thinking about philosophy and you're trying to talk to yourself, but that's not the same as I am aware of myself and what I am seeking to accomplish. Okay. The reason that that's actually a derivative form of consciousness is because what we primarily are in our day-to-day activities is what Heidegger calls Dasein, but a better term for it for our purposes is we are engaged in skillful coping. And what that means is when you're going about your practical activities, you're not thinking about yourself. You're really not thinking about anything. You're on a kind of autopilot, and you just know you're just familiar with your environment, and you don't have to think about it. And so even your interactions with other people involve this, he calls it readiness to hand, but even your default with other people involves this kind of spontaneous know-how of how to go about successfully navigating the situation without giving it any thought. And the very fact that that's our default on our day-to-day level, it always gives enjoyment or drive the opportunity to sneak in, right? And undermine what you consciously set out to do. Because the way I would want to put it is that skillful coping is always an opportunity for the drive. Because you can't have this guard up all the time. And so whatever you think you're going to do throughout the day, it's going to be undermined by what your spontaneous activity in your engaged activity allows for. And it's a way where death drive can sneak in. You can't always have this reflective guard up and this intentional stance towards your behavior. You're going to engage in things you're familiar with. You're not going to think about it. And that's good, because if you actually had to think about everything, oh, look at this object I've seen 100 times. I believe this is called a lamp. Oh, I know what to do here. If I flip the switch, it'll make I don't have to do that. I know what the fucking lamp does. I just skillfully engage with the environment without any thoughts or or any conceptual planning. And because that's our default, we can't keep that intentional spark or willpower. Something else in us gets the opportunity to run the show. And what you do is whatever type of form of drive or enjoyment you're trying to resist, I swear to you, you'll just find yourself back in it. And you're sitting there going, how? I said I wasn't gonna fucking do this. How did I get back here? And it's because of this thing called being in the world, or skillful coping that Heidegger's talking about, because that's our default setting, that we can always just, through our engaged activity, find ourselves back in repetitious circuits of enjoyment.
Boom. And so
willpower is not going to defeat it.
No.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I'll just say, Nick, I think your question is what we need to dive into here in a sec. But I think we just, everyone, if you have a thing to say about the quotes and stuff, I'll just say, yeah. So whether it's washing your hands 100 times a day, and not being able to leave the house if you don't, put the key in the lock, 50 times or whatever. Or if it's you're habitually cheating and it's ruining all of your relationships, or if you're a compulsive liar, like that new H-Bomber guy video, if anybody's seen it, that guy is this, like, he used to be this famous gamer guy, the most compulsive liar in the world. I'm just like mind blown by this guy. What is that? Well, everyone's got their kind of jouissance, and you can't just cut it out. Right. There might be a way to get it to move to something else, but it might become something worse. And so that's what, and Lacan's keen on this. And so you have to be careful. And this is why there's a responsibility in the ethics of psychoanalysis for the analyst to not just be like, oh, you need to be living your best life, here's how to do it, because that can backfire in terrible ways. And so I'll just say my closing thought on this before we get into a class analysis kind of thing is just that I'm genuinely worried for Jonah Hill, because he's officially put himself out here as one of the faces of therapy culture. I would not be surprised if he's running around naked, screaming, cutting himself for other people, or doing something really crazy in about a year, because the pressure he was already under isn't going to go away. It's only going to get worse now that the therapism ideologues, the worst part of the internet, they're going to fixate on him, wanting him to be this figure,
and they're embodiments of the superego.
Yes.
Enjoy therapy, enjoy being the leading. You have to get it right. Yeah.
I'm Jonah Hill.
And now that he's
in all your favorite movies, so I know a thing or two about therapy because I've been in it, and you should too. Enjoy it, right? By letting go of the stick, because before it's like, oh, I would think I'm crazy, going to therapy. People will make fun of me or think I'm weird. But it's like, now it's like therapy culture is like, no, going to therapy. Everybody's doing it. Everybody has this radical acceptance, and we have our trigger words that we got to be wary about. It's just like, it's this new superego of enjoyment, and toleration. That
in line with that, here's a question for everybody. Should you tell your therapist you love them, and should they say it back? Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen it.
That's how the film ends. Hold on. So I've got a thing on that. Okay. Just to get at the heart of what Dave's getting at, and what we've talked about with superego, and then what you were saying, Andrew, like, here's the issue, is that the superegos, because they're, a lot of the times, Lacanians and Žižekians just say the superego is what commands us to enjoy, and then they leave it at that. They don't flesh it out. So what it is, it's an ethics that bombards us, and it's an ethics of toxic positivity. Everything about this thing has to be perfect, and if you don't get it right, then you've just utterly failed. It's get it right. And when him celebrating therapy, the toxic positivity of it is there can't be anything negative about it. You got to always be positive. There's nothing bad about it. Be positive. Like, what if there is some bad shit about it and he didn't talk about it? And if he comes out, then the whole thing collapses. And this is so much of what is wrapped up in toxic positivity. And Dwayne Roussel is a Lacanian who's really talking about toxic positivity. And I think it's incredibly helpful to link that term to superego. And that's what, no, guess what? I'm not fucking perfect. I don't fucking enjoy myself all the time. And that's fucking fine. But that's what we're not allowed to do. And so Lacan, and I mean, all the Lacanians who know anything about what a Lacanian analyst is supposed to do in our capitalist society, and Zizek says it great. The point is to shift a subject from feeling like they have this duty to always enjoy, this toxic positivity. And you're not trying to go back to traditional societies that say, no, you're not allowed to enjoy. You have to renunciate your enjoyment. You have to live according to your social duty. Fuck your enjoyment, right? No, the new type of dynamic would be something like, you're free to enjoy or not enjoy. It's up to you. And that would be this relief valve, because here's the thing. When you notice that whenever people are in the media, I don't care if it's movie stars talking about their latest film, they have to be totally embodiments of the superego imperative. It's total toxic positivity. When they're doing publicity for a movie, they can't go, you know, I had mixed feelings about this. Like, there's some good experiences I had throughout making the film, but there was some other shit. Like, the director and I, they can never just be honest and just say there was some good shit, there was some bad shit.
Right.
And so what you find is, like, people either they're always drastically negative. Whatever they're going off about's the worst thing ever, and it's pure shit, or it's dutiful, excessive, obscene positivity. And the Lacanian thing would be like, no, the thing's divided. There's good, there's bad. The source of enjoyment is sometimes you hate it, whatever, right? And so I just see what you're saying, Dave. Like, he's trapped himself in this circuit of superegoic positivity towards therapy, and he took on a kind of superegoic duty here, and that shit can break you.
Right. I think that's really interesting too, because it's like about emphasizing the, you know, you can enjoy or not enjoy in the free, like in free associating, because this is something that I mentioned with Nick in our last episode of the Sublime Object series about, like, could you imagine if like a conservative Trump supporter went into psychoanalysis? Because they're always worried about, like, they're always getting canceled, or just any kind of like right wing person. It's like, oh, you just can't say anything nowadays, man. The liberal left just really cancels everything. Like, comedy's not the same anymore. But then when they have this imperative, just like, the only thing is say whatever's on your mind, and they actually try to say that, they're not censored, then the superego kind of gets embodied in that, because then they come up to like something that becomes either uncanny or too close to the fantasy that they want. But then when they actually get it, it's like, wait, did I really?
It's not a transgression at that point.
Yeah, it's not a transgression.
You're being invited to transgress, and therefore the limit's removed. Right. So there's no enjoyment.
Exactly. And that's part of the problem with that type of enjoyment. Look, there's subtle ways to transgress, and transgression can be more or less nuanced. But this type of just childhood, hey, I can't say this slur, I can't say that, so I'm going to say it. Like, that type of juvenile type of enjoyment, it's such a weak form of enjoyment, because all somebody does is, you know what, fuck it, say your little slur, say it. And then they say it, and they're like, and that's it. And that's why a childhood type of transgression is such it's a type of enjoyment that's so dependent on the other. Right. The other can just take it from you at any moment, because they'll go, oh, fuck it, we don't care about the rule, do what you want to do. One of my friends is a kindergarten teacher, and he has a student, and this student, just, if you say you can't stand like this in line, he has to do it, or don't play with the chalk, he has to go do it. And he was like, all I have to do to deflate this kid is just say, do whatever you want.
Right. But that's how it is, though. Like, especially when you look at like the childhood transgressions in like online video gaming, like especially Call of Duty is everybody knows the most toxic, you know, form of enjoyment ever. If they find out you're a minority, or, you know, Jewish or whatever, they just start saying the most, like, you know, trigger warning for the audience, but everybody knows it's like the most like slurs ever. But then when you say whatever's on your mind, or do whatever you want, you know, what pleases you, then it's just like you're in this position.
Deadlock of
uncertainty.
What they can't see is how much of a cuck they are to the limit. Like,
Cut
what a
to the
little-
limit. That's
like
good.
a little bitch, right? Like, oh, my whole sense of enjoyment is they tell me that. It's all they. It's like,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
there's
You're
nothing spontaneous. Like, part of my enjoyment is studying philosophy. Okay, it has been for years. I mean, is there something transgressive about it? I guess, because philosophy challenges the presuppositions of society, but this is a more refined enjoyment because it's not just, I mean, it is not dependent on just, oh, you say I can't do that? Well, I'll show you. Right? I mean,
yeah.
it's
No,
like
no
elementary school jouissance.
no SJW or woke school gets to steal your enjoyment because
Right.
you know that's the thing. It's like, well, that person's entire form of enjoyment is dependent on that person reacting in a specific way.
Absolutely. And so the other
Right.
person has the power over them indirectly.
I think
Right,
we're implicitly getting at like not only the Žižekian, but like the Todd McGowan, like enjoying the right or left.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
So I have a receipts here for you for Nick because he brought up the I love you thing. So Jonah Hill says it early in, then he still says it way later to his therapist. His therapist doesn't say it in response when he says it, but then when Jonah Hill brings up the joke of suing him, which was a funny joke, and they're both kind of laughing. Stutz's response was just like he doesn't even like crack. He just says, I love you, I don't care. So he's saying like if he was to get sued, I love you, I don't care. And then Jonah's like, wouldn't it be funny though if we did all this work together and then we end up doing some like lawsuit? And then he goes, that'd be intimate. Okay. And then later Jonah Hill is like, I don't want to lose you. Because I mean, that's a really raw moment because, you know, this guy's going to die eventually. He's got Parkinson's. Thankfully, the medication's keeping him around, but, you know, it's probably not going to be that much longer. In fact, we were watching it. We were like, oh, no, is it going to say RIP at the end? You know, like, did he actually die already? He's still alive, thankfully. But going back to Jonah Hill and is he okay? First of all, his laugh. I don't want to focus too much on it, but if you just go back through and watch the scenes where he's laughing, sometimes it seems pretty disproportionate to the joke. I don't want to say that's bad acting. I want to say that his relationship with his therapist is a little sus. Second, at the very end, when basically, okay, say what you said at the beginning and then say what you plan to say at the end. And so he sits there and he thinks really hard. And then he says, I wanted to make this movie, blah, 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 blah. And then he does the closeout that he's been thinking about. And he goes, and this is where I'm like, is this a slip? He says, sorry, what is this? Sorry, an alarm going off. He says, I love the life Phil's tools allowed me to have. Go look it up. That's what he said. He said it past tense.
Yeah.
At the end of the movie, he says it past tense.
Yeah, I mean, okay, just
So
That's
like
pretty interesting.
that's great listening, Dave. Like in the psychoanalytic sense, that's really listening.
But I think that's interesting though about like when you were mentioning about like his Parkinson's and stuff like that, because like this shows you that therapists aren't really a sort of subject supposed to know. Like they're just, you know, regular people like us, but then they have a sort of class position that's different from, you know, anybody else. And at the same time, they could be the ideological state apparatuses in the Althusserian sense. But like what's interesting about that, I want to go back to the transference. It seems like in a sense with Stutz, he ends up putting Jonah Hill as the subject supposed to know, because if you notice, he says, and let's take this for granted, you know, his Parkinson's symptoms are stable when he's talking to Jonah, right? No other patient.
Yep.
This is the sort of thing that happens in hysterics and other neurotics that have psychosomatic symptoms. When they're under psychoanalysis in the transference, their symptoms alleviate, whether it's hallucinations, seizures, sense of dizziness, you know, insomnia, whatever the case, they alleviate in the transference. And I see that happen in Stutz. So it's like, again, this is why transference is important. He's not realizing, but he's counter transferring onto Jonah. and that's what's allowing him to work through as well, and he feels alleviated with Jonah and not anybody else. And who knows, maybe it's because it's his most intimate patient, or also the fact that and not to say one is greater than the other, but it's like maybe the mix of him being his most intimate patient, there's a transference in both of them, and then that he's famous.
Yeah, and I thought, that's what to me verges on almost unethical about the documentary, if you think about it, because it's like, it seems like for Jonah, there's some strange triumph, some sense of triumph he feels in putting Stutz in the hot seat near the end. It's kind of like, well, I won in a way, because I elicited a reaction from him.
Yeah, that's the
it seems like on the surface, it's as if he's like, no, I want to give back to my therapist by listening to him talk about his life, putting the limelight on him because he's such a great guy. He deserves all the praise in the world. His technique has allowed me to whatever. But it's like, okay, but what really is the intention here? That's what I wondered.
Yeah. But
you could say, part of it is to reveal Stutz's lack, right? So there's kind of this embarrassing thing, like the whole, it's not embarrassing, it's just vulnerable, right? But this thing with, he's been in a on and off relationship for years. He couldn't really find it in himself to truly commit. And so in a weird way, like Jonah's kind of putting himself in the position of the master. I reveal your lack, but then my advice to you gave you the courage or the motivation to pursue the relationship, and so I've mastered you, right?
Right. It's very perverse in a sense, He
was doing it to his mom too.
Right.
He was doing it to his mom as well.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just
that was a weird scene.
Yeah,
it's weird how he brought his mom on it, and he was like,
okay. All right, so here's the thing. I'm gonna have, I've got a little bit more time, but let me go through a couple things that I wrote. You'll see why that sparked. Okay, so, all right, these three concepts, we didn't even get to them, Dave, but this gives us an opportunity to go into it. So, all right, the shadow. The shadow is the Jungian shadow, more or less, right? On his website, Stutz defines it like this. Your shadow is the characteristic of your personality that you perceive as negative. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who first coined the term, defined it as the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide. Developing a relationship with your shadow allows it to evolve into a powerful source of liberation and healing. Okay, fine. But and here's the thing, I honestly think a Lacanian version of this is possible. What would a Lacanian version of the shadow be? There's two ways to think about it. One, it's the repressed image of oneself, the real imaginary. It is the opposite of the ideal ego. We could call this the repulsive ego, the traumatic ego. This is the imago or image of oneself that we cannot bring ourselves to identify with. However, it can also be, okay, so I just want to say, like, that makes sense to me, that there are images of ourselves, pictures of ourselves from certain angles. We immediately, no, that's not me. Like, I have to disassociate. And so this something like a traumatic ego, repulsive ego, real ego, right? I think that's something that could have some validity.
Is that sort of like the lost image in sort of the optical schema, which Lacan talks about? Like whenever you're in a certain reference point, you see the virtual image or whatever of the inverted bouquet, but it also hides what's not there. And therefore it could be that repressed imago, or as in Freud says, Vorstellung, the sort of idealization of certain affects and symptoms that come up. And as you said earlier, certain like moods or symptoms take on different signification and latch on different things that have no meaning whatsoever. But that's what I guess is part of Vorstellung and the way that it creates certain affective reactions and acting outs in the session.
All that makes sense to me. I don't know if we would have to do further distinctions, right? Because I think we have to talk about actual positive images of ourselves that are too repulsive, dislikable, that we just can't, we repress. Like I don't want to see myself like that.
Right.
Then there are maybe images of ourselves that are simply impossible to attain. So almost like, I'm thinking in Husserlian terms here. Husserl calls the perceptual sides of things adumbrations. And so you walk around a lamp and you're constantly seeing the different sides or aspects of the lamp, right? But what you can never do is get a full image of it. You can't see every aspect of the lamp at once. We could say like that's the image we all really want, is some sort of totalized full image of ourselves, but that is also real, but it's real in a different sense of, it's not traumatic, it's just or repulsive or obscene. It's impossible. Like it's an impossible image. So maybe there's the real image of impossibility and the real image of repulsion or something, like two different types.
And that would be the image that we want to repulse, which we could align with the shadow as far as in a Freudian Lacanian sense, would be that of in Verneinung or Verwerfung, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of which I saw an image of a woman in my dream, but I can assure you it's not my mother.
Yeah, right.
Just need to overly
we want to say, no, that's not me.
Yeah.
But, and I'm not even saying like, it's weird. Of course, there's misrecognition in an image and identifying with an image. It's not you. And yet, in this other sense, like a certain photo of yourself from a dislikable perspective or something.
Right.
This is weird. You almost want to go, but it is you.
Yeah.
And like you're misrecognizing the misrecognition. Like
exactly.
You do have to recognize yourself in the misrecognition
right.
to be truthful. And so it's one of those things where like, maybe it's one of the only things I really liked as far as his practice goes. I don't think it's weird. Like he's trying to get him to identify with an image. So you think like as a Lacanian, I'm supposed to go, no, that's méconnaissance, misrecognition. But right. I'm sitting there going, no, that's a misrecognition that needs to be recognized. Like there's something actually beneficial in him being able to go, no, I look like that. And that was part of me. And identifying with it doesn't make me whole, but I like what Stutz says. When you're not able to identify with that, with some image of yourself like that, it can come back and haunt you. I think that's right.
Yeah. It's constantly there. Like it's going to always return, like the return of the repressed.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like even Brian Becker and his whole thing on his video essay of negation pointed out, it's like this, like when you get to here, it's like the sub or ego is pretty much a series of affirmations and negations that's pretty much trying to resist the total immediacy of the subject or the unconscious that's put into question, that reveals itself through this sort of failure, through empty speech. And within the empty speech, maybe there's that image that comes about it too, because that's from what I've been studying in the therapeutic process. It's not just naming your desire, but also fitting it into the other registers, right? Into the imaginary. Mm-hmm. Because you'll never really leave the ego reference. It's always going to be there, but just like it won't undermine you. You won't constantly need to resist, your desire. That's the point, is to enjoy your symptom so that you don't compulsively repeat in excess or undermine yourself.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the other two I want to get to snapshot, right? So Stutz's concept of the snapshot is basically Lacan's concept of the fundamental fantasy. There's nothing worse than the actualization of one's fundamental fantasy, which Jonah did actualize, because you find out that the fantasy that organized your whole life cannot make good on its promise. That is, it cannot provide you with the wholeness and completion that it stages phantasmatically. Yeah. To traverse the fantasy is to realize that the enjoyment is in the fantasy itself and not in the objective actualization of the fantasy. The enjoyment is the fantasy insofar as it keeps it at a distance. It keeps enjoyment at a distance, and that's where the actual enjoy. Okay, so it keeps whole, perfect enjoyment at a distance, and that's what is the source of our partial enjoyment. Mm-hmm. So to quote Todd McGowan, we enjoy what we don't have. Fantasy is so enjoyable because it is a not having. You don't have the enjoyment, and that's what enables you to have it, right? Because the whole thing is there's no such thing as perfect enjoyment in an actualized state. The only perfect enjoyment there is in fantasy, and that's why fantasy is so enjoyable. But we think, oh, if I can get that in real life, oh, it'll be even better than in fantasy, and it's nothing. It's not even as close as good as it is in fantasy. So the enjoyment is not in the actual scenario and the objective state of affairs, but rather in the subjective fantasy of that scenario. This is what we Lacanians and Žižekians call looking awry.
Yeah.
And so the point is, right, and this is the Lacanian twist, and this is what, like, I was watching it and I'm like, holy shit, some of our key concepts are here, but Stutz doesn't have the conceptual tools to connect the dots. Okay, so the fundamental fantasy he calls a snapshot. It's this frozen perfect image of yourself basically getting your full enjoyment, right? It's almost a blissful state of euphoria. And so, but the trick is us Lacanians know how to actually interpret a fundamental fantasy and how it connects to desire, right? So Jonah's snapshot was an answer to his mother's desire, right? The scene with Jonah's mother actually contains an encounter with the split between what us Lacanians call demand and desire. A demand is what somebody explicitly tells you they want, but the desire is what you can detect in them implicitly, tacitly, that they really want, behind what they say they want. Jonah's mother demanded that he lose weight for health reasons, but young Jonah interpreted the desire operating beneath her demand. That is, to speak like Joan Kopchek, he read his mother's desire. Mm-hmm. And remember, for Lacan, desire is nothing but the interpretation of desire. Jonah interpreted his mother's desire via his fundamental fantasy, his snapshot, to be for him to be an attractive, successful, fit movie star. This was his answer to her kvoy, that is, to the riddle of her enigmatic desire. The unconscious logic was something like this. Jonah saying to himself, if I can satisfy the desire of the other, my mother, then I myself will be whole. That is, I will finally get my hands on my lost enjoyment, what we call objet petit a. Mm-hmm. Jonah is a person who actually actualizes fundamental fantasy, unlike most of us. And what did he say about it? What was it like to realize it for him? He said it was devastating, since it did not make good on its promise. He based all his hopes and dreams on that fantasy, but that fantasy was nothing but a liar. And so there we see, okay, she's telling him, I just want you to lose weight for health reasons. But he's sitting there going, nah, that's what she's saying. But what she's really saying is, I want you to be an attractive movie star so you can be, in a broader sense, like enjoyable to women in general, right? Desirable to women in general. And he goes, well, how do I do that? Oh, if I'm like this, then that's what the other desires. And if I satisfy the other's desire, I satisfy my own desire and I have completion, right? And so I just think it's great that the snapshot and then the whole thing with his mom really lends itself to a Lacanian interpretation.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we got to touch on class as a way of wrapping this up, right? Is that can we get into it?
Let's do it.
I lead off?
Can I do a couple bullet points that this isn't like a big conversational thing. I just want to, just for sake of clarification, and then we'll go into class. Yeah. Okay. So, okay, the bullet points go like this. There is a difference between a mentor and an analyst. And the biggest difference is that for us Lacanians, the analyst should never become like a friend or a parent, a surrogate father, a surrogate mother. It actually prevents the unconscious from manifesting itself. The analyst ought to be like the mechanic who you pay to work on your car. You never end up telling your mechanic that you love him. You never tell him your life stories. It's a pure transaction, right? The mechanic's just a function. They perform a function for you. You pay them. That's it. Having friends is great. Having good parents is also great. Having helpful advisors is great. But those are all relationships with other people, other egos. The analyst isn't supposed to be a person, but instead a pure function. the facilitator of your own access to your unconscious. Being a mentor is nothing like being a Freudian Lacanian analyst. I had a mentor, his name's Doug Washer, mentor in philosophy, and I am lucky as fuck to have had him as a mentor. But that also means that Doug could have never been my analyst. So it's important to make this distinction. No Lacanian is saying, oh, it's bad to have mentors, it's bad to have friends, it's bad to have advice. No, it's just a pure psychoanalyst is none of those. And if they become one, those type of personal dynamics between patient and analyst are going to block up the work of analysis. They're going to clog it up and get in the way of doing the work of the unconscious. And so there's that. A couple more bullet points, but if anybody wants to add to that, go ahead.
No, I think that is definitely perfect, because like to get into the whole thing of like ideology, class, and the way that therapy culture functions as sort of ideological like buffer zone, for lack of a better term. But just the fact that like it keeps us sort of sedated. It's like, okay, like in the sense of like what Zizek calls Western Buddhism, and the fact that therapy could act as mindfulness, trying to find your true potential, your true self, and develop these sort of like ascetic practices, or something that's different from this sort of like, oh, like destructive patterns or behaviors or thought patterns. You also want to like the way that these things function also rely on someone who is supposed to be not only a master or licensed in these things, that should probably have the best life because they're soliciting these things to you, but you end up seeing them as a mentor, as ego. There are so many people that I've known that are like, yeah, I really like my therapist. I sometimes wish that my therapist was my best friend and I could just like have drinks with them outside of, the session. And it's just like that type of thing, and mirroring is just like what sort of derails any type of further potentiality of treatment in the analytical sense, because like you pointed out, the analyst is sort of a function and not an ego that you can mirror or relate to. And when you get into like even other forms of like transference focused based therapy, sometimes they do it from a relational standpoint that it ends up becoming egoic, where they mirror with each other, and countertransference is involved to try to get to the resistance of the patient, where it's like, oh, you're giving too much, or you're saying too much at the wrong time in the wrong place. Where like Lacan says, it's like, never saying too little or too much, too soon or too late. And especially in the overture of the Seminar on One, he says the master breaks the silence with anything, but at the same time, he doesn't have a ready-made science, refuses a symptom, or a system, not a symptom, Freudian slip, but a system. And he even notes that countertransference shows that there's not only two people, but it shows that overall that there's a language that's mediated, and why you need to attack the function, or pretty much situate the function of it, and not mirror the patient, or having the patient mirror you. And I think
totally. Like, I mean, right. It's the L schema. Totally.
Right.
I mean, and yeah, it's simply the fact that when you're operating or interacting with another person, you sit there and you go, they look a certain way. I mean, you don't think this to yourself, but this is what happened. Do you like the way they look? Do you think they like the way you look? Do you like what they're saying? Do you like what they're interested in? Oh, you do? You don't? Like this, all this kind of, this is what we call imaginary dynamics, or ego to ego dynamics. Yes. And it's just us identifying or disidentifying with the person. And there's a kind of struggle for recognition involved here. And the point is, so long as that's the axis on which the relationship is operating, you never tap into the unconscious. Right. And what the symbolic axis, or me as a lacking subject in relation to the other, which the other here is my unconscious. The unconscious is the discourse of the other, right? Which is to say, my unconscious is not something hiding deep down in my heart or soul or my mind. It's something operative within language itself. That's what the other here means, is the field of language. And so I have to, if for me to have any sort of relation at all with my unconscious, it has to be through my relationship to language itself, through the actual signifiers I speak. And that is part of this other issue, right? Is that nowhere does Stutz focus on the actual signifiers of his patient's discourse. What Stutz focuses on is the intended signifieds or meanings of the ego. So the Lacanian insight here is that if you're paying attention to what someone is trying to say, you're operating with them at the ego level, because that's where they're consciously intending what they say. But the unconscious, and this is why Freudian slips are so important for Freudians and Lacanians, it's the actual signifier that slips out that's connected to the unconscious. The unconscious desire is connected to that actual signifier, not in what somebody tries to make it mean, but the signifier itself. Right. And so this is this other thing. Ego psychology keeps us trapped within the on that imaginary axis of the L schema, keeps us trapped into ego to ego, and it does not broaden out to facilitate my lacking subjectivity's relationship to my unconscious, the other's discourse. And so that's a huge difference between Lacanian psychoanalysis and any form of ego psychology.
Well, speaking of Freudian slip, I had that slip and I said ready-made symptom rather than system, but it's true, because that's what, if you look at the materialization of a symptom as far as ideologically speaking, I just want to keep this short, is that, like, look at what Žižek talks about in the homology of the dream, right? In sort of like how the interpretation of the commodity and then the dream analysis have, they line up and create a sort of social symptom. If we see therapy culture as a sort of commodification, then there's already a ready-made symptom, because think about it, like, what is this sort of subject put into question? Who is the subject, put into question that's supposed to be this ready-made healed person? What is meant by a true self? That's already a commodification right there of something that is lacking, but you can gain, right, through the sort of already like exchange. But we wouldn't see that, because what Žižek talks about is like the way we see ourselves as this like practical solipsist that's isolated from the economic and material conditions. And not only that, but it's not that this true self or like somebody that will be successful is this like abstract phantasmagoria. It has materiality when this therapist, whether CBT, DBT, or some type of psychotherapy personnel, is like, oh, if you have any questions, I would recommend this book. This self-help book helped me out so much. You can find this on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. It's Eckhart Tolle, or like it's yada, yada, yada. They are ready to hand out some type of self-help book, and that sort of captures, and signifies the sort of, true self signifier in there. And they sell it to you.
And see, then that's the whole thing, right? When we talk about the true self or connecting to the true self, that's the bullshit that ego psychology or therapism or any of this type of stuff does, is it tries to sell you on this idea that there's a true self that you somehow your current inauthentic self can merge with, and becoming that true authentic version of yourself will give you what we call ontological wholeness. It will give you metaphysical completion. And that is what Lacanian analysis is fundamentally against, and that our desire for completion is an actual symptom. Like it's a kind of mental illness that we suffer from. And this is maybe one of the strongest fruitful aspects of Lacanian analysis, is part of the reason you're suffering is because you think you're supposed to be complete. You're not. And that realization is a way to resolve like a grander symptom of trying to like substantialize yourself as some sort of pure identity or pure essence. And you're not. You're fragmented, you're contradictory, you're torn between yourself, and that is your true self. And so I think that's a huge two things, and then we'll go to what we all know we've been waiting for. Let's see. All right, just on a side note, I do wonder what Lacan, if he would find it interesting that Stutz draws those little diagrams, and then I don't think he would like that he gives them to the patients, but I think he might find those little diagrams he draws somewhat interesting. What do you guys think of that?
I mean, it just reminds me of like what every chaplain in the Navy does. They give you little diagrams, and like any other like, psychotherapy practice, they always draw diagrams and give them to you.
Is another way we we get caught up in the ego because we're identifying with, right, that's me, but
yeah,
it's not
like
me.
we become idolaters like Leclerc.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now, before we get,
wait,
go ahead.
Just one thing. Andrew just pointed out what is going to be. It's just like on my way out of this thing, I've been very fair to Stutz. In fact, I just said in the chat that I think Stutz would have agreed with you on this. Like, he's against perfection and he wants you just to embrace the process. You have to find a way of loving the process of working on yourself, because you're never going to be perfect. And that snapshot of perfection is what's killing you. He would agree to some degree here. He's, like you said, though, he's just not able to connect the dots, right? But though I have done my best throughout this entire conversation up till now to be very sympathetic to Stutz, as well as like Jonah Hill, he acts like he is the fucking guru who has downloaded the answers to the universe. And okay, fair enough. No, this whole film is like, Jonah loves this guy and really wants his message to get out there. And this guy thinks his tools will help people. And Jonah thinks the same thing. And so, okay, let's presume that that's all true. He's not the only fucking guy who draws diagrams, though. And beyond that, he's not the only guy who's like, psychoanalysis doesn't actually work in this American way. Therefore, instead of just telling a person my interpretation of them, I should give them something to do. Like he's a maverick. This is the norm now.
Yeah,
this is 2020.
Masters of your life.
This Netflix came out in 2022. They're acting like he's the first fucking guy to do this. Jordan Peterson's 12 rules for life is like, clean your room. Yeah. This is literally the same fucking shit. And so, I love it, but at the same time, though, here's the thing.
Atomic habits.
If he was referencing all of his sources all the time, then everyone would be like, oh, stodgy academic. Their brains would turn off. He's trying to be normie friendly. And I think that therapists want to just, they find their own way to put things into their own words. And then they don't give credit where credit's due, because that would ruin the transference, maybe. I don't know. But he is acting like he invented all of this stuff with his subjects or his analysts' hands. And in the book, I tried to find the quote. I couldn't find the quote. Now I'm second guessing myself on if I actually saw this. So take this with a grain of salt, everybody. But I swear to God, he says that he realized he's getting his ideas, not just from free association or something like that, but from like God. So he might have said, like, at one point he said he defines God as
W thing, is he?
Yeah, at one point he defines God as like whatever is the guiding force behind evolution. So he keeps it all like vague like this. But he does believe that he's tapped into cosmic wisdom with his own personal made up approach. And so it's like he thinks that he's come onto this planet. Everyone was doing it wrong. He reinvented the wheel by working with his subjects and just downloading God consciousness, and that he doesn't owe a debt to various schools of psychology and the insights that have been provided by them before him.
Bud. Give Jung his credit. Jung's,
yeah.
You think you're I would say Jung?
Yeah, I would just be like, Wilhelm Reich apparently tapped into, the cosmic universe, and he said, "Bust a nut."
Yeah, that's one thing
that's all that
we're missing here is like, what is therapy? What even is therapy? It's like, here's his technique that's so special and so unique, and it comes directly from the big man himself upstairs. And it's like, okay, but what even is therapy to begin with? And I mean, it's not a major surprise that, your average American doesn't understand what the distinctions are between different schools of psychology versus psychoanalysis. People don't know what psychoanalysis even is. They only grasp it as like a vague, they understand that there are deviations from psychoanalysis that we have now.
Mhm.
Like, and they only grasp what psychoanalysis is via this idea that there are productive deviations from it that have led to these successful techniques that are always under development. There are teams of scientists, working on how to better understand the, frontal cortex and how to address that and tap into the traumas that are knotted in that part of the brain. And it's like, no, like, let's get at what the root of psychoanalysis even is, and like what this technique was meant to address. But of course we can't bring up Freud because he's persona non grata.
Hey, I have a quote from Seminar 17 I put aside, and I'm just going to say it. Lacan says, "Don't expect anything more subversive in my discourse than that I do not claim to have a solution."
Right.
I mean, and that's part of this issue is that, look, there's this general sense of like, oh, the end of Lacanian analysis involves identification with the symptom, or traversing the fantasy, or subjective destitution, which I want to get to in a second. But Lacan was basically very open to the idea, like, I don't know, like, I don't want to prescribe a definite goal to all analyses. There's singularities, and there is no blueprint for how to end an analysis. Every patient is a singularity. Their unconscious is a singularity. Their symptoms are singular, and you have to. This is why this DSM-5 bullshit, like why he hated that. Like, you are not a category. You are a singular speaking being. And whatever is going on with you has to be dealt with as a singularity. And yes, identification with the symptom, that can help. Traversing the fantasy often is necessary. And subjective destitution can be a radical act of freedom. But even him, he doesn't want to say, oh, yes, you have to go identification with the symptom, traversing the fantasy, subjective destitution. He's not going to do that. No. And in fact, he's going to say, I don't have one fixed solution for what the goal of analysis is going to be. And that is part of his honesty.
Right. That's how every analyst should be like, because it's like, if you have a goal, and that means like you've already put a category on this patient as soon as they walked in and said one word. It's like, no, like he says, the fun is over. Don't get too excited. Right. And sometimes even in Lacanian ideology, they have this thing is, as soon as the patient starts speaking, they're like, oh yeah, they're a hysteric, and it's like they're using these clinical structures as mouthwash. Like they pretty much are just throwing them out there, and it's like they already know. It's like, no, you need to listen, And then that goes for any psychoanalytic theory too. Like even in object relations, it's like, yeah, one day with this patient, they're already splitting. I think they're borderline. It's like, no, you need to listen.
Yeah.
Like,
okay, Dave, there two last points for real, and then we're on to the big subject. Okay, I just want to say, so here's the real point that I think we were all trying to say, the sticking point. Just because this type of therapy helped Jonah at the egoic level doesn't mean it was successful at the level of the unconscious. But if it works, then it's right? Wrong. And that's kind of sums up our position on this, where, look, some people actually, part of what will help them is having a friend or having a mentor that can actually make their life better. But that is not the work of analysis. And just because you did that, don't think like you've undergone some sort of like reconciliation with your unconscious, like you've done anything to your unconscious, right? And then, okay, that's the last point before the main one. And I just have to point it out. All right. This is one of the big points of contention between Stutz and Lacan. So Stutz refers to his atheist parents as lacking a support. He said that they had nothing to fall back on, right? Well, in light of what Dave just said, he's one of these therapists that in some way, shape, or form is going to tell you that what you need is to have some sort of connection with your ultimate support, which is God.
Right.
And it's going to be whether, I don't know what kind of concept he's working with, but they all typically have one. It's a harmonious union type of thing. And whether the God is more on the personal side or the impersonal side doesn't really matter, because what the idea is that if I come into connection with this being in some way, shape, or form, that's my ultimate support. And that's the ground of my being. And that's going to be the true relief that I've been looking for. And to this, Lacan couldn't be more opposed. Right. Lacanian psychoanalysis is a radical form of atheism. And when I was just talking about subjective destitution, that's what the process is. And part of what Lacanian psychoanalysis is going to do, especially with neurotics, obviously, is try to get them to deal with the fact that there is no big other. And what that means is that there is no external institution or authority or body of knowledge that can give you that sense of wholeness you're seeking. So subjective destitution, in part, it's complicated, but in part what it is, I come to deal with the fact that I'm a split being, that I'm symptomal, that I am never going to be consistently whole, right? But even if you do that, there's almost a disavowal, like, okay, I'm alienated from myself. I'm subject to a split subjectivity, but the other isn't split, which is to say God or the church or your political party or whatever it is that you think you're devoting yourself to.
Free market.
And the free market, exactly. And so the point is, you kind of disavow your own thing. And it's like, okay, I in and of myself can't make myself whole, but the other who is whole, I can get some sort of wholeness from the other. And Lacan says the next step. So this first step about recognizing myself as I'm incomplete, I'm alienated, he calls that alienation. The next step is separation. And separation is when you come to deal with the fact that the other doesn't have the substantial, coherent, plentiful being that you wish you had, right? The other is lacking too. The other is contradictory, inconsistent, and that means it can't give you what you're looking for. And this is the radical atheism, is it's saying, even if there is a God, even if there is a creator, you're not going to get some sense of absolute subjective coherence here on earth, right?
Right.
There's Christians for a long time have liked to take this idea like, oh, coming into relationship with God, it heals the wound of my subjectivity. It gives me a pure relationship with myself. It does this or that or the other. And the point is, all you have to do is stop and think about how silly this is for a second. You'll see it. If entering into union with God truly gave me a pure, non-antagonistic form of subjectivity, if it means that you heal the wound in me and I'm no longer a split subject because now I've related myself to God, what that means is I stop having dreams, because dreams, as we know, are where our unconscious desire manifests itself. We never have a Freudian slip. Why are you going to have a parapraxis? A parapraxis is the result of your split subjectivity, right? You're never going to have a slip of the tongue. You're never going to have a kind of hysterical somatic symptom of any sort. You're not going to have an obsessional symptom. You go down the list, right? Well, right. All you have to do is, I've known lots of people who believe in God. They're still split subjects.
Right.
And so this type of fantasy of the other can provide me with wholeness or completion or subjective harmony. Lacan's absolutely against that. And freedom is going, I'm a lacking subject who's contradictory and inconsistent, and so is the big other. So the big other, I got to stop investing myself in it like it has all the final answers, can answer all the big questions about me. No, it doesn't have the big answer, and it itself is lacking. And why I can't believe in it in the way that we're supposed to believe, like as theists will tell you, you're supposed to believe in God. I can't believe in God if God is lacking like me. Like, okay, so this is, and here's the point, right? If we are driving ourselves crazy, if our neuroses are in any way, shape, or form linked to our unconscious belief that the big other can provide us with this type of ontological completion, and that's the source of our neurotic suffering, then the point is to get rid of the big other as consistent and substantial, and to see it as the lacking other that it is. And then it's like, okay, the acceptance is I'm lacking, so is everyone else. There's no big fix to any of it, and I just have to cope with that reality. And the point is, to embracing that, the hope is that you won't have the neurotic symptoms that you have.
Right. What it makes me think, though, when you're talking about the lacking in the big other, or we could call it the master signifier, like I'm getting for they know not what they do vibes. I want to know if you could tie that in with that.
Well, let's maybe talk about the class.
I could, but like
Here.
I'd want the quotes, and then that would be a whole thing. Maybe hey, we're gonna talk again. So
yeah, that we can definitely do that on our own time. I would love to know what the
Dave,
is there.
Come back, Dave.
Come back.
Dave has ceded the floor to me, and I have nothing to say. No,
well, I certainly do.
Let's see. So Stutz wants to adjust Jonah Hill so that Jonah Hill can be a better version of himself. As we have concluded up until this point, it's basically, it's the big other that's going to, in some sense, dictate what this best version of yourself would be. But the big other is lacking, and the big other cannot remove the split. Mm-hmm. How can we relate this, though, to political economy or even political ontology? What are the political valences of psychoanalysis, and why do we feel like what Stutz is doing probably doesn't have too many potentially revolutionary political valences to it?
Yeah. Okay. So I've been waiting for this part. Here's the ideology of therapy. Here's the ideology. And what do we mean by ideology? Ideology, the way we're using the term, it's not just your belief system. Okay. We use it in a more specific way than that. Ideology is what conceals or covers over some sort of traumatic deadlock, some sort of traumatic problem operating in society, and not one that is external to that society, some sort of structural problem baked into society itself that determines society from top to bottom, and yet we can't get rid of it if we're going to maintain this type of society. So the point is, now, of course, for Žižek, the social symptom is class struggle. It's class division, and that this is the fundamental structural antagonism baked into society. And what ideology does, whether we're in classical society, a quote primitive society, a feudal society, capitalist society, doesn't matter. What ideology does is covers over class struggle. It in some way, it either justifies it, it tries to neutralize it as a problem. It's going to obfuscate the material conditions that are structured around class struggle, class antagonism. And so what Therapism does is, you notice the whole time, there's like, okay, so hold on, let's stand back. So the question is, when it comes to, oh, I need to do all this personal work, I need to make myself better and better and better. Well, who has the time and energy to do all this extra labor? If to work on yourself, on your body, on your relationships with others, if you're stuck in wage labor, you're stuck on a grind, just trying to pay the bills. There's no economic dimension brought in to this therapism, this ego psychology at all, right? And Stutz, we alluded to it earlier. Like, is money a factor here? Well, it's not for Jonah. Jonah's fine. But what about everybody else who needs self-care or self-work, right?
Right.
If you're broke and you're struggling just to, buy food and get by, well, then it's funny how all of this therapeutic talk leaves out the economic dimension. Seems to conceal it, doesn't it? It's all personal responsibility. We're not going to talk about how structural dynamics affect your moods, affect your enjoyment. In fact, that's funny. That was a good slip. How they affect your whole being, right? We're going to bracket that out. We're not going to talk about capitalism. We're not going to talk about commodities. We're not going to talk about wage labor. We're not going to talk about your job. We're not going to talk about your rent. All that shit. Right. No, we're going to just talk about your emotions and talk about your hopes and dreams and all this kind of shit. And this is the ideological dimension of it. So, you want to? Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, notice how that not only connects to the bourgeois, like the petite bourgeois or whatever you want to stick in the ML format, or PMC, and in some cases, like if you're like working class or maybe you have a good paying job and like you live in the nice suburbs, like those things connect with you and they isolate the material conditions that like set you up for success or that keep you comfortable and complacent in a capitalist society. But notice how that never reaches the hood or the wood.
Mm-hmm.
It never does.
No, exactly.
Social workers come there, but even then, they never bother to tackle the systematic conditions or economic conditions that maintain gang violence, or some type of poverty within there that makes
what rural whites are going through.
Yeah, exactly. Or in Compton, or Watts, or anywhere in New York, or over here in Virginia,
No, exactly. I mean, and it almost obfuscates. I mean, you want to talk about one thing that capitalist ideology wants to just use ride it till the wheels fall off, is creating this division between poor rural whites and poor inner city minorities. Right. Because if those two ever say, oh, no, we're not different, we're on the same fucking page here, that's what they do not want. No. And, but no, therapism is for, therapy culture. It's all for people who have enough money to do this extra self-care. And so, it's funny, think about it. Let's do the pyramid again. The life force, body, others, me. Where's society? Where's the big other? Where's the social
Margaret Thatcher said, all
this shit exists, right? Where's the virtual matrix of rules, laws, prohibitions, economic principles, this whole social field that mediates my relationship to my body, to others, and to myself? Oh, we're just not going to mention the playing field at all. We're just going to talk about the players, right? This is liberal bullshit. This is there's only individuals. This is fucking Margaret Thatcher. There is no society, right?
Only individuals, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's same ideological bullshit, but with a blanket. Right. And so where's the relation to society? Where's the relation to the overarching structure of the world? It's absent. We're not going to talk about that. And that's ideology. So here's what I've got on this. Stutz says it's important to increase your life force and become passionate about living. But there are two huge elephants in the room that he conveniently leaves out. What our friend here, Dave, calls time, energy, and money. Therapists always bracket out the economic dimension of our lives. This is what I like to call the therapeutical epoche. Therapy is built on the liberal concept of the individual, pure competitor without any rigged playing field. Right. What if you are suffering because of capitalism? What if the source of your depression is wage slavery itself? What if it stems from burnout, hustle culture, capitalist temporality, the grind, or just trying to pay your fucking bills? Oh, and on top of wage labor, now you're also supposed to do all this self-care labor. Fuck off. Therapists act as though their patients live in an economic void that they have no economic facticity. It's like how on sitcoms, characters never seem to struggle financially. And if they do, the problem is resolved by the end of the episode.
Right. Exactly.
So my biggest problem with therapy is the economic problem.
Right.
I'm a card-carrying Marxist here.
Yeah.
What about one structural economic facticity? This is the question Zizek posed to Jordan Peterson in their debate. Peterson is all about begin with yourself, set your house in order, clean your room, take baby steps. But what if your life is in disorder precisely because of how society itself is structured? Are we really going to tell North Koreans that the way to fix their lives is by taking more personal responsibility? What a fucking joke. No, they are suffering because of their authoritarian symbolic order. What if the order itself is oppressive? Just as Americans and most people are suffering due to wage labor, due to their economic circumstances, and we can can we agree that we need both? More personal responsibility, more social restructuration? Sure. However, I don't need to readjust my subjective relationship towards wage labor. No, I need wage labor itself to change or die. If all therapy is to make us better suited to be wage slaves, then therapy is the new opium of the people. Exactly. It's no coincidence that people talk about therapy as if it were religion. I'm done.
But like, that's the thing though, is that like when you negate like those like economic conditions, especially going back to the hood, it's like when we talk about excess, it's like, you know, in your earlier conversation in this episode about some people want to gamble or need to gamble or to function, or like some people need, you know, the alcohol, you know, in the hood, it's like, if you're dealing with other economic conditions, you're dealing with gang violence, even if you're neutral to it, but the fact that you have to deal with it every day, if you're like a high school student trying just to freaking make it out and you have like a single mom on food stamps, it's like the only thing that's very transgressive that helps you get by, or even if you like you're out of school and you're a worker, is to go to that freaking corner liquor store and get 240s of an OE and get a freaking Dutch Masters. Like, yep. That's your thing right there. And that's something that a PMC liberal like therapy culture bro would be like, oh, touch grass. Like, no, you don't understand what I go through. Sometimes just freaking rolling up a freaking backwood and and sipping on a 40 helps out. You know, what are you gonna do with that?
Or getting in a fight.
Yeah, or getting in a fight. Yeah.
And that's the thing, right? So, yeah, it's just out of touch. It leaves the economic shit out. That's the ideology, and that to me is the great stain on all of this.
Yep.
Dave?
And so, yeah, thanks everybody. That I realized I just wanted to listen to you all like this was a podcast for a bit, and I went out and I had a cigarette, and then I started a fire in the sauna so that I could stay warm because it was getting fucking cold as tits in here. And then I had this nice little nicotine rush because I don't ever smoke, but every once in a blue moon, you know. And then when you keep it to once every couple of months, it's actually enjoyable. Anyway, so you know, there's my enjoyment. But so I want to talk about the professional managerial class and the PMC, not get it confused with the bourgeoisie, because there's a very important distinction here. And for the online left today, especially for people with any kind of a basis in Marxism, usually they will just say they don't like the term the PMC, they prefer the petite bourgeoisie, or just stop calling it the PMC, it's the bourgeoisie. This is not useful. The PMC as a class, the professional managerial class, if it is a class, I'm not gonna say it has to be a class. It could be a subsection of the working class. And without a doubt, they are workers. They do have to work. They have nothing to exchange but their labor, right? Except that it's very qualified labor power because they've been through the university system usually in order to get the credentials that they need to be able to have a very high salaried position. Why do they have a high salaried position though? It's because they work for the bourgeoisie. Why do they work for the bourgeoisie? Because, well, obviously they need to survive. And the working class parents' dream is that their children will be able to become a doctor, a lawyer, a therapist like Dr. Phil Stutz. And there's nothing wrong with that because we all want what's best for our loved ones. I'm totally sympathetic in that sense. But what is it doing in the sense that of how Mikey is using this term ideology? You touched on it earlier, Andrew, when you talked about Althusser's idea of the ideological state apparatus. Obviously, on the right, they care about the repressive state apparatuses, and they could do without the ideological state apparatuses because they're like, well, we need the military, we need the police, we need the border guards. They're not interested in strong public funding and support for hospitals for everyone, school for everyone, etc. Now, that's the Democrats' interest, and that's because the Democrats have tended since the 60s to focus on the professionalization of their constituency. So that means that though their money comes from the bourgeoisie, their nominal constituency, the people that they pander to in their rhetoric, is the people who are trying to get out of the wood or the hood by raising themselves up by their bootstraps or getting their kids into college.
Yes.
Okay. Now, raising yourself up by your bootstraps, this is the petty bourgeois ideology, there's an element of that in Stutz, obviously. You want people to think that they've earned it, that they've worked hard. But from the professional managerial class ideology standpoint, what is it doing for reproducing capital? Okay. For Foucault, in his knowledge power piece, when he's arguing with some Maoists, because he was a Maoist, he's transitioning, this is his point of transition, and he's arguing with them. He's basically saying that the judicial structure and the prisons themselves have functioned and serve a historical role, functioning as the wedge between the proletariat and the non-proletarianized workers, which in normal Marxist terms would be the lumpen proletariat. The lumpen proletariat is going to be like sex workers and migrant farmers. And now today we call them gig economy people, but it's basically the people who don't have one of these more reliable blue collar careers. Okay.
They don't have a W-2 or anything, right? To say they're workers, but they're still working.
Exactly. Well, and the role for Foucault of the judiciary and the prison system is to make the proletariat feel like, oh, we're the disciplined workers who've earned our place in these unions, and all of these people usually understood through racialized terms instead of class terms. Mm-hmm. They don't deserve this kind of position as a worker because they're the rabble. Okay. Yeah. And so obviously the rabble combining forces with the more proletarianized workers is exactly what they don't want to have happen. So Foucault, seeing that this has been a tendency in the 20th century as a reaction to working class organizing, he's like, we need to do something, we need to be aware of this, because what happened in the Cultural Revolution was the exact same judiciary structure was reintroduced, where you had representatives supposedly representing the public will stepping in as intermediaries between the people and the people who were adjudicating over disputes between the people and the people who were causing problems for the people, whatever. Anyway, and this representative class is part of the PMC. But what Foucault doesn't get into in that piece is the other wedge that's driven, not at the bottom between the lowest and then the proletarianized workers, but the wedge that's driven between the proletarianized workers and the people that are above them, the people who call the shots over them and who manage the reproduction of capital through the exploitation of labor power. The people who are in charge of that, and this is why I say we can hold on to the term PMC even if it's not a class, because we can just say PMC stands for the professional managers of capital. Okay, PMC, it's still PMC. The professional managers of capital need to believe that they've earned their place in the class system by saying the right things, by doing the right things in school, by getting the right credentials. Okay, but what happens for a person who has a bullshit job or is ultimately telling people they need to work longer hours for lower pay because we're going through an economic crisis right now? This is just what you got to do. You got to try harder. That's a hard position to be in, and you're going to want to kill yourself if you are that PMC person who's doing that. So what does the bourgeoisie do? It says, oh, PMC will pay for your therapy. Oh, PMC will give you such a high salary, you can get whatever help you need. We'll set up workshops. You can all sit around and do, your TB, whatever. You can do your personality types, and you can, the therapy culture thing comes in as a way of getting the PMC individuals to cope. Okay, it's about getting them to
as an Amazon worker because I know your Myers-Briggs personality chart.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the thing is that insofar as the various things that function under this broad umbrella therapism, insofar as they work, these PMC individuals are going to find that very exciting. And they're going to say, oh my God, it works. But then because they don't have a class analysis, they're going to say, it works for me, so it'll work for you workers. And what happened here is that Jonah Hill, going through the crisis of somebody who, you know, for all the reasons we already talked about, but also his class position is a weird one. He is a representative, and he's supposed to play out an ideological role. He's trying to do the thing that one is supposed to do in this position, which is to say, I've gone to therapy. Now I'm one of the good ones. Now I deserve this status. And now that I deserve this status, thanks to these tools, I really want to do a good thing and give back by making sure you all have these tools. You might not be able to afford therapy, but at least you can watch this documentary. The problem with that, obviously, is that people self-diagnosing themselves because they watched this documentary or because they read it a little bit online and now they think they can think in therapeutic terms. They've not gone through the most important part, which is the actual relationship with that person. Right. And what often happens through the works of people like Simon Sinek, like Brene Brown, or young Pablo, is that they're basically saying, hey guys, we're all in this together. And so this union thing, don't worry about it. All you got to do is learn to be vulnerable and speak to your needs in a nonviolent way with your managers, and we'll all figure it out together. Okay, when Mikey already said it, what they need is shorter days, higher pay. That's always what they need. That's never changed. But every time capitalism goes through one of its cyclical, every 10-year crises, generalized profitability crises, what occurs is the prices for everything need to be raised and in order to make profit. But the only way that they're going to make a profit by raising the prices on everything is by selectively not raising the price on one commodity in particular. And it's always the exact same commodity that doesn't go up during a time of inflation. Mm-hmm. It's always the commodity of labor power.
Right.
Yep. The commodity of labor power, that price will never go up. And in fact, if it stays the same and all the other prices go up, then obviously you're getting demoted, mm-hmm. and you're getting less pay. And you come vexed to work thinking, I'm doing all the things I have been taught to do. I'm trying so hard. And they say, oh, I understand. I've had such a hard time. What you need to learn, though, is to be less toxic and practice vulnerability and check out this book. Maybe read it when you get home before you fall asleep.
When you get to read scripts and surf all day.
Right. The body that keeps score. But I really connect with that, Dave, because like that's exactly what, even in like when you were talking about how the right really cares about maintaining the state repressive apparatuses and could care less about the ideological one, because you listed one of them, the military. What am I in? The military. And I've been through a lot of the mental health resources that they offer, group therapy. And it's always a civilian and one like military commissioned officer who's a psych officer, never was enlisted, was in JROTC, came from a good suburb family and did the right thing that they were supposed to do. They went to college and they're like, I should probably serve my country. And then I'm going to be a therapist and help people out because that's what they believe was the right thing to do. And then they get a bunch of enlisted personnel, whether it's from E0 to E7 that's been in for almost 15 years and just believes that they need to do the right thing as being a chief. They're just like, why am I failing? I feel bad about being like the outcast of the chief's mess because, I feel crazy. And the only thing they could do is be like, you just need to touch grass. You just need to, be vulnerable. And at the same time, the general consensus that everybody's agreeing, even with the chief, the only chief that's in there and everybody else is like an E5 and below, is that they're tired of their E7, their chief that doesn't understand them, that just cares about the mission, doesn't realize that these E5 and below are, you know, recovering from like using alcohol as a bad coping mechanism. They feel alienated, they feel overworked, they feel underpaid, they're going under debt. And the only thing with the civilian and even like the, you know, the officer in psychiatry is just like, you know, what I'm getting is that you all just feel overworked. So, you know, maybe coming up together with, you know, your relatable circumstances, like come up with a plan on your own and just like rely on each other and just, you know, talk it out. And it's just like, if that's what you, because, you know, the chief that you hate, your boss that you hate at work, your chain of command, they don't care that, you know, you're talking about them at the therapy. They don't know what the fuck you're doing. They just know, oh, my sailor is at a therapy appointment. Doc said, you know, the medical office said I just can't fuck with them. So I'm just not going to touch them because otherwise I'll lose my job or I'll get reported. So I'm just going to be at bay and be like, yo, are you all right? Are you good to work? All right, get back to work. That's it. But they don't care.
Yeah.
They don't care that, you know, oh, you're practicing mindfulness. Oh, you're practicing acceptance, or like you're not doing any fortune telling thinking. That's good to know. You know, I'm a human being too. It's like, no, get back to work. You know, we got to go underway next week, and you're our top engineer, and we need you. That's all they care about.
Mm-hmm.
Can we,
and if they did, go Nick.
No, I just wanted to build on something you were saying. I want to know if we can relate this concept of being the best version of oneself, which is a phrase that's bandied about a lot nowadays, to what you were saying about earning status or feeling like you've earned status in that PMC sense. Do you think that this idea of earning this status is what's behind the veil of this phrase of like being the best version of yourself?
Yeah, well, yeah. Yes, I do. And so, you know, it's like, hey, you know, practice humility, self-crit by saying that you're privileged, right? And actually, by doing these things, you're one of the good ones. And by being one of the good ones, we won't cut you out when we have to get rid of 10% of our workforce, right? Because that's ultimately what all these workshops are about, whether it's an anti-racism workshop or it's a let's do our personalities workshop. These workshops that are usually optional, if you don't do them, you're at the bottom of the pile, you're going to get cut. And so what you do is you go to all these workshops. Now, obviously, if you can get something out of it and that helps you, then fantastic. But most of the time it's like, oh God. But then a handful of people are like, oh shit, this really explains everything. And when it explains everything, then they really want to bring it to you. And here you are trying to work. And now they're like, here, I've got the thing. And so the status thing, we got to keep in mind, there's also, money's not everything. There's also social and cultural capital. For navigating this particular subsection of the working class, there is nothing more important than your social and cultural capital. I mean, it helps to have, like Dr. Phil Stutz, an annual net worth of $7 million, which is something like $87,000 per month. I don't know if that adds up, but that's what this website says. And I looked at like 7 different websites. They all say the exact same sort of thing here about it's between 6 to 7 million, and he's whatever. You got to believe that you're not one of the greedy Trump-like bourgeois assholes who has made that money by exploiting workers or by fucking over investors or by fucking over other companies or by acting competitive and greedy. And notice how capitalism just became, insofar as there's a critique of capitalism, now it's a critique of affect, it's a critique of personality. And so I went to college and I'm woke. And so because I can acknowledge that I'm privileged, now I'm in a different space. And now I'm deserving of my insanely high
Jonah
salary.
Hill does do that. I noticed, there's this whole thing that people in that position do where they're like, I acknowledge my privilege and then never speak of it again.
Right.
Basically.
It's something
But
like
it's just as long as I said it, I acknowledged it, I'm good. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Exonerated.
That has that documentary series where he goes to different like countries. Like, I just want to be experienced of all the cultures and just like not be biased because, my privilege and I'm American. Like, the variables are empty.
Who does that?
Zac Efron. He's got that.
Oh, yeah.
I forget what the documentary series, but it's like him and another actor. They go to different countries and they try, like, they not only try the food, but like they experience their culture. Like it's, I don't know. It's like Planet Earth or some shit like that. It's just one of those things. It's like, I'm in this privileged position. I recognize it. So I'm just going to go to other countries and realize, I'm ignorant, but I want to just accept everybody and just bring it back to America. So they realize that, I'm like this.
So this is hold on. Like, this is where, I can't just be philosophical, objective about the shit. No, I take it personally. When somebody's telling me that I need to work on my life force or develop my passion, but I'm supposed to do that without my time, energy, and having money, fuck you. Like, you ain't got shit from me. You want to be the big other? You got the answers that will help 100% guarantee. Give me money, motherfucker.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean change my material conditions.
Yeah.
And then come talk to me about how I can improve myself. Until you change my material conditions, shut the fuck up about what I need to do to change myself. I ain't falling for your ideological bullshit. Okay. Everybody can be better. Everybody can be more understanding and vulnerable. Blow it out your fucking ass. I need time, energy, and money to be able to engage in my passion. Okay. And if we ain't talking about that, we're not talking about shit. That's first step. We want to make me a better version of myself. Let's do it. Right. Change my material conditions.
Right. It's like T.I. said, if you got the money, miss me with it. Right.
Yeah. And I know. So just think of the little exercise that Stutz walks Jonah Hill through, which is, this is how you escape the maze. Stop holding a grudge and imagine love all around you. Now let it overflow in your heart. Now direct it towards the person that you hate and realize, if I can be one with this bastard, I can be one with anybody. Now I've escaped the maze and now I can move forward in my life. Okay, what if that motherfucker, though, is your boss who literally just reamed your ass because you bought a pallet of the wrong water, and for him, his personal water, he wants bottles of smart water. I'm using Mikey's example here.
Right.
What I'm supposed to project love onto him, and now I'm out of my situation? Yeah, that would move me up a class.
Or how about I just envision myself moving through the dark clouds and I go to the sunshine? You know what my sunshine is? Time, energy plus money. Now let's give me some fucking sunshine.
Right. We can play on this whole meditation all we want, but like, even like, I work in a warehouse too, just like all three of you. Like, I have to order all this like grease and oil for new aircrafts that are made by the military that have specific maintenance and materials that they need to grease their components. And if they're not the right ones, then they can't light off their engines. And because I ordered the ones that the paperwork said that they gave us, because they didn't know about, they're just like, hey, it says we need this. And I ordered it and they got the wrong things. And then I'm getting hemmed up like by my boss, like, you ordered the wrong ones. Are you dumb? It's like, no, your senior chiefs are fucking dumb. But I get ringed up because I'm the E5 and they're the E7s and E8s and above. It's just like, I'm supposed to give love to them, because I can't give them the right components or grease or oil or lubricant so that these engines can light off so they can go on deployment.
Well, and so I just want to clarify. I'm not saying, well, okay, there's some negation for you. I am saying that therapists owe it to give to financially support all their patients. That's what I'm saying. Now, look, I understand that's not a reality, but here's what is a reality. If a therapist is not concerned with the patient's material conditions and takes into account the structure in which that person's life is oriented, if they're not taking the economic facticity, the class situation, if they're the wages, if that is not part of them taking into account what the patient needs, you're not an ally in any way, shape, or form to that person's well-being.
Right.
And so your duty isn't to financially support every one of your patients, of course not, but it is to give a fuck about their material conditions and to take them into account.
I want to finish the thought about I brought up
gotta
three
go
names.
in a minute, but yeah, finish up.
Well, it's just the three names I brought up because
Okay.
if anybody's read one of them, they might be like, well, how are they implicated in this? Simon Sinek is the guy who goes around talking about leading from behind. He's very much like Mark Fisher and Slavoj Žižek's like super egoic sort of spokesperson, which is to say, like managers, he would want the manager who, when you come back from therapy, Andrew, he would want that manager, instead of just being like, oh, you good? Okay, get back to work. He would want that person to tell you, I love you. I care about you. Okay, so that's Simon Sinek. Brene Brown is the one that has made vulnerability and healing the words that they are for the therapy culture people online. She's the courage to be person. It's all about the courage to be vulnerable. Okay. And then young Pablo is probably the most likable out of them all. And it's because he's less enshrined or ensconced, I guess, in these institutions. He's just someone who made it big on Instagram.
Right.
And what he does is he makes poem. He'll take an ancient wisdom idea about like something practical, about like a way to cope, and he will distill it down into its most simplistic form in a form of poetry and post one of these every day. And then I was reading his book at Amazon while on break because the book came across and I was looking at it. I was like, oh, inwardness. I've heard of this guy. And so I was looking at it and stuff. And then when I was back to work, I was listening to some interviews he did. And this one he does with this guy in London, this American guy who has some show in London. He's saying, you know, what our generation has been realizing in this conversation that we have been having over the last 5 years was first how to find yourself and how to take control of your life. And that was very important for all of us as a generation to grow into ourselves. But now that we've learned how to do that, we need to learn how to let go. Now, I mean, fuck yeah, learn to let go, dude. And absolutely. But the people who follow you on Instagram and the people who pay for you to come and give talks at workplaces, they're not the we that encompasses humanity. They're a subsection of a class. And so he's like, we, the generation of world historic spirit moving through, marching through the ages. Yeah. We've come to this higher state of consciousness. It's like, you mean the people who you're speaking to, and that ain't me. No. And it's definitely not any of us. So yeah.
You know what? And here's the thing. This whole new dynamic they're trying to facilitate with managers in relation to average real workers is pure ideology. And why? It's Zizek's point. The only thing worse than a bad master is a good master. Right. And his point is that the good master is worse because it seems to make mastery okay.
Yeah, like, did you have a good fuck?
Exactly. That's where I was going next. You're right. Because here's the point. So if we take it a step further, right? If you relate to them as a person, you obfuscate the fact that no, they still have power over you. This is not friend-to-friend dynamic, but the friend-to-friend dynamic obfuscates the power relation, and that's why a good master is worse than a bad one. And so Zizek's other example is the difference between traditional authority and postmodern authority. And it's the same thing, right? The traditional authority says, hey, I don't give a shit how you feel about doing your duty. Go visit your grandma. It's her birthday. Go visit her. Behave yourself. I don't give a shit if you want to do it. It's the right thing to do. Go behave. All right. The postmodern authority, or father, whatever, says, you know how much your grandma loves you, but you should only go and visit her if you really, really want to. I'm not going to make you, but that would be the nice thing to do, but only if you want to. Now, this contains a much stronger command. It's not go visit your grandma out of a sense of duty. It's go visit your grandma out of a sense of duty. Oh, and by the way, you have to fucking like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. You have to celebrate. Like, no, sometimes you got to do shit because you don't, it's just the way it is. But this is that super egoic spin, and it's ever so subtle. But what it does is this whole therapy dynamic with managers, it's not only do I have to have you as a manager, I have to like it.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
No,
Mhm.
I don't. Fuck you.
And it is the difference between, and Mark Fisher's like a genius for being able to simplify it so well for us all. The difference between the movies Blue Collar and Office Space. And Mike,
Yes.
you just saw Blue Collar this year and was like, you got to watch this. And basically, yeah, Blue Collar, they're all working in an auto shop, auto factory, making cars. And the manager always comes out like literally calling them slurs, yelling at them, telling them what to do. And to some degree, they're able to be like, fuck you, Jerry, or whatever his name is.
Yeah.
And they're all kind of like, fuck you. And there's like this antagonistic relationship between the manager and the
And it's
workers. It's in
immediately
the
present
open.
for all of them.
Yeah, but as long as you are productive and you get the job done, they're not going to fire you because you talked back a little bit, because, hey, also there was a union that helped. Now, in Office Space, though, it's the perfect scene is the one where they go to the restaurant and the gal she's wearing the flare, which is like the pins all over the. Can you actually tell this story, Mikey? You'll be better at it.
Yeah, so Jennifer Aniston's a waitress in a restaurant. It's kind of like an Applebee's. And so they're required to wear, I forget the exact number, 13 pieces of flare, right? So every day she comes in and she puts in flare, it's like little fun buttons or whatever, right? on her apron or whatever. And she comes in, she does her duty and she does the bare minimum and puts on 13 pieces. And her manager comes over and he's like, I see that you're wearing the bare minimum, but we really want you to go above and beyond and really express yourself. And you see Brian over there? Well, he has on 32 pieces of flare, and he's just really, really living the spirit of Applebee's or whatever, Chili's or wherever they're at, right? And so she's sitting there going, well, do you want me to put on more flare? And he's like, no. And what he's really saying is, I want you to enjoy putting on more flare. I don't want to have to tell you to do it. You should just enjoy exceeding and going above and beyond in your duty, right? And so it's a much more oppressive dynamic than the asshole in the car factory plant, right? Just being a prick to you and you yelling back. It's much more honest,
right?
Authentic form of power.
Right.
And
isn't that different from what, I mean, like what Stutz, isn't he kind of more of the conservative where he's like, shut the fuck up, listen to what I say, and this will help you, rather than like, I want you to want to be helped, right?
Maybe. See, I'm torn on that one thing, right? Because yes, he says, shut the fuck up, do what I tell you, you'll feel better. But he also comes to disavow that position.
Yeah.
And it's just saying, like, it's just an initial trick, right? It's to get him hooked. So he himself doesn't actually mean it. Like he all he's trying to do is sell them on the idea that he has some sort of knowledge that can immediately help them. And here's the trick is the very thought that he has knowledge that can help him immediately is what keeps him coming back. It's not that he actually changes their life immediately. Right. It's that he gives them the sense of hope that their life will change immediately. Right. And so I don't know. And the point of the matter is, even if that's his initial thing he does, and I mean, because people walk in, they have that's what transference is. I believe this other person has a special knowledge about me that can help me that I don't have access to. And if I just, they have the special knowledge. So if I take them as my master, then things will get better for me. But he doesn't actually stick to that, because the true master does not become your friend.
Mhm.
And he ends up in the same position as the postmodern authority, where he still has a kind of authority over him, but now we're buds. And so that authority is obfuscated. That's the trick. The postmodern ideology of authority is that the authoritative dynamic is obfuscated. It's concealed under a veneer of care, concern, friendship. We're just buds hanging out. That bullshit. No, we're not just buds hanging out.
Right.
You can fire my ass. I can't fire you.
I think most of us have to hop off at this point.
Right.
But any final words?
I do have. I have something.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I love you.
I love you.
I don't want to lose you.
I don't want to lose you guys either. You guys completely. Yeah.
And if you tell anybody I said about the military, I'll sue y'all.
Does anyone have a green screen? If we had a green screen, we could lay down, walk through our visions.
This sounds intimate.
Waves lapping on the water.
I just think it's
Hey,
funny.
I'll just say this.
Okay.
Oh, Jonah, if you are watching this, because I mean, it's a small world. It really is. Like, for real though.
Yeah.
And anyone who's like a big fan, I mean, for real, we love his movies. We love him. And this is a genuine attempt to do a good thing. I genuinely believe that. And so all I would say is, look out for the vampire castle. Look out for the therapy culture. Look out for the lack of a class analysis. That Stutz doesn't seem to want you to go that deep in thinking about privilege or whatever. And obviously, privilege is a little different for a celebrity than it is for I don't know, someone like Stutz. But nevertheless, I just want to say thank you for putting it out there.
Yeah.
And anybody, thank you for putting this on our radar. Sharon, did I say it right? Is that her name? Your friend, Mikey. Shannon. Yeah. Thanks for putting it on our radar. And I think a lot of people are going to watch this and feel very inspired and want to do something with it. And writing is a good place to start. And yeah, do try to get some help from anyone who can help you. And, if you can afford Lacanian psychoanalysis, maybe that would be the good thing for you. But also at the end of the day, almost everything that they're telling us that we need to do to be our best selves is a trick to make us just distracted from the fact that, like, no, nothing's going to make up for the fact that we're not being paid enough and that we don't have our time energy. That's all.
Yeah. I just want to add, I just want to say too, like, on the off chance that Jonah Hill actually watches this, dude, I love your movies. You are one of the most talented actors. And I just, like, from Super Bad to Wolf of Wall Street, like, you just constantly are killing it. And again, if the therapy helped you, man, God bless. I hope it did. And all I would say is, if you appreciate this type of therapy, there's even greater theory out there. Jacques Lacan, Sigmund Freud, philosophers like Deleuze and Guattari, Slavoj Žižek, Jean Baudrillard, Karl Marx. Like, when you get wrapped up in these motherfuckers, it's very special. And
welcome to the big leagues.
Yeah, that's what I wish, the big leagues on you, because you deserve it.
He's a pretty good director too.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah.
Mid-90s was a good movie.
Oh, dude, I fucking love. That's one of the best. Like, I'm gonna write something on mid-90s at some point, because it is the best form of nostalgia there is, and I have a whole theory of why that is. But what he did in that film is incredibly special. It's not the bullshit type of nostalgia that you get from easy, like, oh, look at hey, look, Goonies, Back to the Future, wow. It's getting at something much more profound. And so when I get around to writing about nostalgia, it's my go-to reference.
Jonah Hill, you're the only funny person in Accepted. Let's
yeah, exactly. And he might have suffered from castration, because ask me about my wiener.
All right, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Later, guys. Have a good night.